Why do we still care about Gundam? I know it's a simple question, and I don't mean it in a critical way. Why, after decades upon decades, do we still care about this show? So much has happened in the world. So many wars, so many events, cultural trends. History has unfolded in a tapestry before us, but Gundam has endured. Now it is true, one could ask this question of nearly any work that endures, and get to the root of the matter. But Gundam is a big thing. It's a huge thing, really. It matters a lot to me, so I feel valid breaking out the big thematic high mega particle beam question on it. Now firstly, there is one little snag I will obliterate right now.
Oh, but Argenbolt, it's just merchandise. It's just friggin' toys, just Gunpla. That's all there is to it. A giant corporation keeping this franchise alive to sell toys.
Now I can confidently say that this is fucking absurd. While it is true many later works had this play a big part in contributing to the establishment of the franchise, this retroactively makes zero sense. To be short, the Gundam toys sucked. They were crap. It's easy to forget that in our modern age, where our Gunpla is superposable and seemingly omnipresent. It feels now like Gunpla is everywhere, but in the beginning, it was nowhere. So the toys that did exist at the time were terrible. So it makes retroactively no sense. The merchandising doesn't explain Gundam's initial explosion of popularity. After all, there were dozens of robot shows with year after year of toys, but most of them never got Gundam big, and even the larger ones pale in comparison to Gundam. And what's more, I now know the toys almost killed Gundam. What? Yes, ironic, isn't it? First off, let me thank anime historian Jonathan Clements, as well as the casual postings of Mark Simmons and Ihoba for their indirect but interesting pieces of history. As well, I want to directly thank Morlock for getting me started with YouTube videos and with some links for this Gundam idea, and very much Conan for getting me a good chunk of the research and for working with me to figure out a lot of the stuff that I used in this video. Oh, and a special last minute thanks to Ferryden for watching too many 1970s anime. Speaking of which, as Simmons mentions 1999 book, The Complete Works of Yoshiyuki Tomino, Wataru Sekioka, the producer on Gundam, firmly blamed the toy company Clover for canceling Gundam. Yes, you heard that right. Basically, the old assumed rumor that it was low ratings that canceled Gundam doesn't add up enough. Gundam's ratings were not amazing, but they were doing fairly well in certain areas. Even Tomino himself chalked the cancellation up to ratings. But you know what was struggling? What was really struggling? One of the primary motivations for the creation of the show? The sales of the terrible Clover Gundam toys. So Sekioka says in the book that the heads of Clover, once more, the toy company, probably wanted to end Gundam early to capitalize on the Christmas/New Year's sales while they could. Then start the next Sunrise Mecha anime, Invincible Robo Trider G7, in time for the March toy season. So yes, in the greatest irony, the toy company, bypassing the heads of Studio Sunrise and the Gundam staff, including Tomino, pushed to have it cancelled 2 months early in a meeting none of the members were at, out of pure capitalist greed, almost strangling Gundam in the cradle. So once and for all, no, well, you can add merchandise as a motivator later. For this work, our inaugural Gundam, the one that started the wave, the most important foundational work in the franchise, was almost killed by its terrible fucking toys. Only after its sleeper hit status rippled out did Bandai's Gunpla help it take off. The Gundam had to exist before the Gunpla. As if I even need to say that. So, with that out of the way, now we can firmly say, no, it was not the toys. Okay, great. But what was it then? Why do we still care? What made Gundam special? Why do you, a Western world human born almost 2 decades later, care? Especially now, half a century after Gundam aired. What makes this show special? What is the essence of Gundam? As always, I will start with, admittedly, a lot of context. And this is going to be a long one. I can feel it now as I'm writing these words and now recording them. Feel free to pause and maybe come back if you want. I'm going to dig deep, real deep. I'm going to show you just what this work did, how it rode the wave of Japan in the 70s, catalyzed a generation, and founded arguably the single largest mecha franchise in human history. In this, On Gundam! We must start at the beginning. Oh, and before you ask, yes, this is relevant, and you'll see why when I show you the Tears of Time. In the Paleolithic era, the first peoples to settle in the nation we now call Japan crossed over the seas. The first wave of these peoples would become what we now know as the Jomon culture. They used stone tools, made pottery, and had figures made of clay. Millennia later, the Yayoi people would migrate from mainland Asia. These new peoples brought agriculture and the domestication of many new plants and animals. This bloomed their population on the sparse farmland. Over the next eons, the two peoples would mix. The story of Japan builds from here. This rocky series of islands would have these waves of human migration spread outward. Using ancient Chinese culture as a template, the Japanese would form their own version between the valleys and coasts. Their population would increase, and their capitals would move ever north and eastward along the main islands. Over the subsequent centuries, Japan would alternate between periods of intense war, where the island's mountainous terrain and valleys empowered multitudes of warlords to vie for power and control, and periods of sublime peace, where the Chinese-derived centralized government and capital would exert supreme control. From these two emerged the two main figures to keep in mind going forward: the political religious head of the Emperor and Empress of Japan, and the cyclical daimyo and shogun, the strongest ruling clan of military control, who would change era to era, coming and going as new opportunities opened up in times of war, and grew stagnant and decrepit in times of peace. These two powers and states ebbed and flowed, until the period known as the Sengoku Jidai. From 1467 to 1615, for over an entire human lifetime, war ravaged across the core islands of Japan. The armored samurai would fight in massive battles. Civilians would perish mercilessly. It was during this period something ominous began lurking on the horizon. Strange, highly advanced naval ships began to arrive, washed ashore in storm or sailing into ports. They hailed from an impossibly distant part of the world. They brought with them trade. They brought with them destruction. The firearm, something that had its roots in much closer China, it had been carried to this place, Europe, and there mutated through the bloody dark history of those lands to become something terrifying. With it, the wars of the Sengoku Jidai were fought and came at last to a bloody close. Japan was unified by Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. Seeking stability after the bloodbath of the Sengoku, the Tokugawa shogunate monopolized violence under a strict class system, and more important to our story, cut off Japan from the outside world. It would be the greatest and last time the old shoguns would dominate Japan. After a lifetime of war, Japan would know almost 270 years of peace. Now, we skip forward. 100 years before the creation of Gundam, we can now trace from our wider context the roots of what truly would lead to our destination. During that 270 years of the Edo period, Europe was not at peace. Over the 17 and early 1800s, Europe fought and through the Napoleonic Wars forged the cannon, the ship, the rifle, all bred and interbred, advanced, refined, killed one another. Coming to a bloody close with the defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo, the Congress of Vienna in 1815 would put a seal on Europe's largest bloodbath for 100 years. But this merely turned European ambitions outwards instead. The exploration and colonization which had begun centuries earlier was now accelerated. The maps of the world were filled in by the cartographers' pens, sailors' sextants, and soldiers' machete and gun. And even that was not enough. For across the Pacific, something had happened. The European seed had germinated. The single most important other member to our story, the United States, had formed. And so now, from both the east and the west, the land named Nippon, in its solitude, was encroached on. This came to a head with the U.S. expedition under Commodore Matthew Perry and his Black Fleet. They sailed into Japan and cast open the doors of the rising sun, waking from slumber and isolation that nation. The US and Europe mainly wanted access to far larger China, though the irony of this was lost to history. What Perry did in that moment was set Japan on a collision course with the West, and more specific to our story today, the creation of the work known as Gundam. For during that long history of Japan, at many times the royal house and their loyal warriors had wanted a restoration to occur. Tired of being secondary to the Tokugawa shogunate, the imperial house leapt at the opportunity that had arisen. And so, 100 years before Gundam, in the span of less than 20 years, the Tokugawa shogunate, the Edo period, and the samurai class were all ended or effectively destroyed. In perhaps the greatest irony, the defining Meiji Restoration would succeed exactly because of the imperial house embracing the new strategies of America, Europe, and the West. Its weapons and technology. But this time, there would be no isolation, and so now we may skip ahead just a bit further. Almost there. Japan is at its imperial military apex. The Meiji era has totally transformed it. European tradition has now interwoven into the rocky island's very personality. From clothing, food, and drink, to culture and especially technology, Japan took the lessons Europe was all too happy to impart on it, and soaked them in. What Tokugawa did in unifying Japan was primate. What Perry did in forcing it open to the West set the fuse. And Japan under Emperor Meiji detonated and unleashed the raw human potential of that place. It has become an industrial powerhouse. In spite of its lack of natural resources, or perhaps just so because of that, Japan is expanding in every direction. This naturally brought it into conflict with a power, one of the mighty by world standards, but least mighty by European standards, Russia. For you see, in addition to European technology, Japan has absorbed something far more dangerous than any rifle or battleship: ideology. Japan sees itself as an Asian country, but more so than that, the most worthy Asian country, one that must liberate the rest of Asia from Europe. Of course, under its nationalist interests. This is the power of Russia stretched eastward, and Japan blossoming westward. This was the war that was inevitable. And what was the result? Tremendous victory. A European power, Russia, was defeated, more than defeated, wholly beaten, humiliated, by an Asian nation. The naval victory at Tsushima in particular is such an unprecedented success, it is hard to imagine that all that follows could happen without it. Japan, upon which European ships spilled their guts of rifles in war, in whose harbor US ships demanded trade, has now, by sea, trounced a European power, with the European tactics and vessels. This, combined with the victory of the Russo-Japanese War, inflates and permanently warps the Imperial Japanese military ego, forever, until its destruction. Without Tsushima, there is no Pearl Harbor. Without Tsushima and Pearl Harbor, there is no Loom. The idea of a technological pivotal turning point battle in a conflict. The ironclad battleship at Tsushima. The use of carrier-based aviation at Pearl Harbor. The mobile suits at Loom. This ego, born of technology. From this ego, Japan eyes all directions hungrily. The Chinese states of Manchuria and all of China. The Korean Peninsula. The Philippines, Indonesia, and beyond. Even perhaps India. Either already in Japanese control or under their control in imperial dreams. Japan sits with the victors of World War I. The Taisho era heralds prosperity half a decade before the Roaring Twenties. Even the downturn of the 1930s cannot seemingly halt Japanese progress. And for the first time since the Meiji Restoration, the warlords begin to hold more and more sway. Sure, now they're not called shogun or daimyo, Now they hold ranks like Admiral and General. They dress in European styles, but wield eerily similar powers. Now both these new shogun and the imperial house are united in their ambition for Japan to seize the world if possible. And furthermore, all the success has emboldened a new group, the Zaibatsu. The capitalist, imperialist, profit, and ego are mixing into a potent and horrific toxin. Of course, we know how this all ends. For across the Pacific, the other blossoming world power, the United States, exists. It has more people, it has more resources, and it has, most importantly, stronger bonds with Europe. It is a power unprecedented, a colony state grown tall and strong enough to surpass the Europe that seeded it. And so, within the arrogance of the Japanese Empire, this clash of powers hangs heavy. Japan will seize Asia, by ship and by rifle, and now by airplane, submarine, and aircraft carrier. Already in Europe, Hitler has just invaded Poland. And so, one final time we jump into the future. The subsequent 6 years will be a disaster for the whole world, not the least of which Asia and Japan will in turn destroy and conquer, and then be destroyed and conquered. Inhuman war crimes, civilian death. Japan will perpetrate this on many far weaker Asian nations, and then in turn, feel this wrath return to it. During this period, in 1941, a young boy is born. His name is Yoshiyuki Tomino. The war turns worse and worse for Japan. Waves of American bombers level Japanese cities, industrial and military targets. US submarines sink Japanese ships. We all know how this story ends. I am confident in saying now that it was both for the best for humanity and absolutely necessary for the creation of Gundam that Japan lost World War II. But fate and history, my dear viewer, work in mysterious ways. Oh, and they adore irony. America, the nation responsible for delivering the lethal blow to Imperial Japan, by that fate, has now become chief architect in its reconstruction. Japan, despite the annihilation of its empire, or perhaps motivated by just that, leaps forward. The US gets a front-line nation to pen in the communists across the Pacific, and Japan rebuilds. It then enters the nuclear era. The following 3 decades see just as much radical change, if not more, than the previous entirety of the Meiji and Taisho. The Showa era from the end of World War II has been something amazing. Japan has rebounded. As the US sought to fortify Japan as a liberal capitalist economic state, Japan has done once more what Japan does best. It has taken all the lessons of the West, learned them, and where possible, gone further. From 1955 to 1965, Japan experiences the Japanese economic miracle. From a nation essentially destroyed at the end of World War II, to by the late 1970s, to having a nominal GDP that will rise to over 900 billion. By 1980, it will hit $1 trillion. Every home would have the new 3 sacred treasures of Japan: the television, the washing machine, and the refrigerator. Of course, economic prosperity doesn't mean perfection. Even reeling from the single largest war in human history, the golden afterglow of prosperity and the dark shadows of regret can only last so long. History never ends, and so we arrive, at last. Pretty much everything I will mention now will come up again later specifically. From the larger context, we now narrow down to what will be needed for Gundam. The best word for the world, and Japan in the 1970s, is cynical. The Keynesian economics of rebuilding the world are running out of steam. The Vietnam War has effectively made an entire generation of young people despise the US. From its previously heroic status as liberator and savior of the Pacific and Europe, even Korea, the US has now fallen quite a bit from 10 years of blood and death in the jungles of Southeast Asia. At the same time, the US withdrawal was hard to celebrate in the West as a true victory. Because between the scarred generation of conscript PTSD veterans and lingering cultural pain, the US now exists as a culturally fractured nation. The young people are using music, shared culture, broadcast by radio, TV, and camera. Oh, and they're using drugs. Lots and lots and lots of drugs to bond. They dream of futures, of a future founded on empathy and peace, in contrast to the conformist violence that has defined their youth. Japan is faring about as badly. New staunch anti-war sentiment means the young people that are likewise not too sympathetic. Speaking of which, did you know that in the 1970s there was a time of unprecedented leftist movements in Japan? The anti-Vietnam blowback, combined with the already class-conscious youth, would come to a head in the Sanrizuka struggle. And the Japanese government decided to bulldoze a small farming community outside of Tokyo to build a bigger modern airport. The Japanese student left, and the new leftist groups in general, will fight on behalf of the farmers of Narita that wanted to stay. The clash lasts from 1963 to 1985, and will involve thousands of protesters and dozens of protests, battles, and events. At the same time, that Vietnam War would also catalyze and test all the atomic age, highly mobile theories of warfare. Mobility in general, but air mobility in particular, becomes mandatory during the Jungle War. The harsh terrain making passage by established forms of warfare extremely difficult. One book, written 20 years before 1979, would focus on just this. The hypermobile fighters, men in atomic-powered suits of fighting armor, armed as well in turn with nukes, able to bounce from one location to another with terrifying power and speed. The mobile infantry. And that nuclear power has been doing a lot at the same time as well. While the space race is essentially beginning its now almost 60-year stagnant coast, back in 1979, the fiery possibility of space still hasn't cooled in the rocket engines within the minds of the general public. Even a cynical 1970s dystopian capitalist future could still very well take place in space. Science fiction serves up this potent combination to general audiences. Just remember, once again, crew expendable. Oh, and there was also an oil-based recession. Fun, fun, fun! And then, less than half a human lifetime since World War II, Japan is opening its first nuclear energy plant. Nuclear power that began this era with the destruction of 2 Japanese cities has now rebuilt it. The nuclear age has inundated and made Japan not just an industrial society, but a technological one as well. The Sony transistor radio becomes a massive success worldwide. Don't dismiss it for its simplicity. This was effectively the iPhone of its day. From a country forged, expanded, and annihilated by technology, to one defined and rebuilt by it, Japan has changed. And now with Technicolor! TVs have likewise stormed into the homes of Japan across the entire nation. They carry with them something equally new and emergent, a form of media made of special effects, and a form of media made of rapidly moving pictures. Like so much else you could see at this point, even with its roots in Japan's nemesis from World War II, American animation, once a tool of propaganda used to justify the destruction of Japan and to fight World War II, much like atomic energy, has now taken root. Japan now makes its own. The industrial processes able to cheaply mass-produce synthetic paints, paints used to make those thousands of images needed to move, to animate, needed to animate, to move. Factories can also pump out toys from the stories of animation, from the animation on TVs. The animation is also in turn achieved by camera, another machine, also made from factories. It is a mechanical, nuclear-powered, industrial, technological age. Its embodiment is mecha. Now, as much as I would love to hop right in, I need to do 2 things. I need to flesh out the landscape of mecha as they existed in the 1970s, and I need to brutally destroy one of the most annoying, lingering bullshit ideas about Gundam. I need to explain that it did not in fact revolutionize mecha, but also that it did. Yes, you heard me right. You see, the human brain has this really bad tendency to try to simplify information. I think it's about like saving on calories and sugar needed to think or something. So when people try and cover this next bit of history, they have a really bad fucking tendency to do just that. Some folks try to dismiss it as being nothing more than a toy commercial. Thankfully, I've already squashed that part. Now we have to deal with the other extreme. This annoyingly persistent idea that before Gundam, no other anime or mecha was special. That they were all simplistic. And that Gundam emerged fully formed from the head of Zeus. That all the other mecha were, mecha Neanderthals, and, Gundam was like the first mecha Homo sapien. Of course, this is absurd. This is like saying that there were no cyberpunk works before The Matrix, or saying that Star Wars was the first space adventure movie. That the Jackson Lord of the Rings were the first serious fantasy works, no hard SF before 2001 A Space Odyssey, no mecha with psychological depth before Evangelion, etc., etc., they're all wrong. Newsflash! Every single landmark work has roots in the time it was made, and objectively is founded on bigger trends likely already well established or found in previous Forerunner works. Gundam here is no different. Newsflash again! This is of course not to say that landmark works are not amazing. They're not big turning points. Of course they are. Of course Gundam was. But pretty much the rest of this video covers and explains just that. Why Gundam is special. So in this section, I will mainly be doing the job of, instead, grounding Gundam in existing trends. Oh, and what was it? Oh, right, and I'll get to Tomino. Obviously, enough of the concept of mecha didn't start with Gundam. Tetsujin 28 would perhaps be a good first starting point. Already, there was a kind of pop culture concept of humanoid fighting machines doing battle on our behalf. The advanced integration of early computers across World War II in particular pushed this concept forward. Things like the US Navy's computer fire control directors that integrated radar sensors and lead targeting to control and direct multiple guns at singular aircraft targets. The Norden bomb sight would be used extensively by the US Air Force as a combination analog computer and sensor to help the US level German and Japanese targets and mostly level cities in the process. Tetsujin 28 as a machine itself is one created for World War II by Dr. Kaneda, only after the war being passed to his son to control and fight crime in a newly rebuilt nuclear-era Japan. So even foundationally, Gundam was not the first work to have elements like World War II be integral to the work in question, or mecha as human tools of war against other humans. Of course, I have to mention Mazinger. Mazinger Z would really pivot our entire concept of mecha with Koji Kabuto piloting the machine himself. At this point, it doesn't really matter how outlandish some of the monsters fighting Mazinger are, because at this point, the main character and audience are directly in the fight. The genius here is simple. 1967's Ultraman and 1971's Kamen Rider both used this direct transformation process. The empowered form of the Ultra Warrior and the cyborg Kamen Rider are not just a power fantasy monster for a young boy to control. This makes the empowered form directly an extension of the protagonist character. Go Nagai developed Devilman and Mazinger very close together in 1972. Translating the appeal of Ultraman and Kamen Rider's direct control and transformation to Devilman's powers, and relevant to us, Koji's direct control. So once again, it wasn't like Gundam came out of nowhere with Amuro's peril at the controls of Gundam. It was built steadily on as a progression of popular trends. I would also argue this control is what made these stories compelling to a new audience of younger viewers, thus enabling the merchandising that would carry through the rest of the decade with the robot wave. Go Nagai would also work with Ken Ishikawa to create Getter Robo.
Oh well, Argenbolt's mentioning Getter Robo, now he's gonna mention the combining mecha. Duh, we know about the G-Armor already. It's so goofy and clearly for toys.
Wait, didn't I kill you? No, actually, it isn't combining robots. It's the pilots. Wait, what? Yeah, think about it. Getter Robo had Ryoma, Hayato, and Musashi. 3 different pilots and 3 different forms of the machine, each with different personalities, responding to the battles and hardship they fought through. It's easy to forget, but Gundam also has Amuro, Kai, and Hayato. Okay, that's interesting. It's probably just a coincidence, right? The main character piloting the main machine, a secondary different personality in a variant version, and a more comic relief dumpy guy in a third dumpy machine. So before we can get Gundam's mass production of the mecha as a tool of war, Getter breaks down the machine, and that fighting experience over a larger cast of characters. Is it as developed as Gundam? No, of course not. But yes, once again, mechanically, works before Gundam are laying the groundwork.
Oh, okay, fine, Archibald, there was mecha stuff before Gundam. But that isn't what made Gundam special. It was the gritty war, it was the gritty adult subject matter. It's a real robot story.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. I can prove you wrong. Already going back to Great Mazinger, heavy stuff like racism was starting to impact the plot. Jun Hono's backstory as a girl ostracized for her half African-American background as an orphan was pretty central to her character. And Space Battleship Yamato. Listen, you know, I had to bring this up eventually. Yamato so clearly cemented a ton of aspects that I literally can't cover them all here, and will be coming back to them in later sections. The Earth is a rust-brown, cratered hellscape. The only and best chance to fight back? One last special super ship, equipped with the latest fighting technology. You don't get White Base without Yamato. And who will pilot this ship? A bunch of well-trained, well-adjusted adults, right? Wrong! Oh no, the main crew is killed in a bombing. Looks like teenagers and young adults will have to work together to endure the brutal war and survive. All while traveling to new plot locations on their ship. Wait, didn't White Base's original crew mostly get killed off when Sharzaku and the Musai attacked the Oh, wow, would you look at that. And who are they fighting in Yamato? A brutal space imperial regime that has devastated the Earth with a war, no less. And this isn't something I'm pulling out of nowhere. Emulating the success and appeal of Space Battleship Yamato was a big goal of Gundam as a project. Eiji Yamura of Sunrise Planning, arguably a founding father of Gundam, and Ryosuke Takahashi, who would later go on to make landmark works like Votoms and Dougram, said as much in an interview from 2003. Yamura: "Oh yeah, back then, Space Battleship Yamato was a big hit." Takahashi: "But if it's a hit, it will be profitable. I say 10,000 or 500,000 viewers. But it's a way of focusing on a specific person or audience. In short, making heavy fans and doing business with them is Yamato. Create around 200,000 enthusiastic fans and sell around that." Interestingly, character designer and storyboard artist Yasuhiko also echoed this in a separate interview. "Up until then, I had the impression that anime was not something for grown-ups to be doing. It was childish, but I had to do it in order to eat." Interviewer: "But since Yamato, the fan base has changed. The number of anime fans has increased. So, with Gundam, we knew in advance that we would aim for a different target and not worry about ratings. Even if we were told that the numbers were low and this was not good, we didn't get upset about it."
No, Archibald, Yamato doesn't count! It isn't a mecha show, can't you see? Gundam was the first mecha show to use gritty war and serious character consequences and villains, right?
Wow, I'm even more glad you mentioned that, because you are dead wrong, again. Voltes 5, one of the big robot romance shows, on the surface seems like another Monster of the Week show, right? The Boazanian villains are using big monsters to attack the Voltes, and it fights back. Another simple baby toy show, right? Well, until the later half of the series, where it's revealed that the planet Boazan is actually pretty similar to Earth. And the enemy they've been fighting, not the monsters, but their creators, are functionally genetically similar enough to interbreed with and are basically just humans. And the actual Boazan Empire is a pretty detailed internal political setup. There's a class system, slave minority and underclass. Oh, and by the way, the super science man who helped make the big Voltes robot, yeah, well, he's actually from them. Oh, and 3 of the main cast who have been fighting with the aliens, well, they're kids of the super science man, which means, what a twist! They were part of the Boazan Empire the whole time, or at least genetically. Listen, I'm not going to summarize everything that happens in Voltes 5. It's a Gundam video, but a lot of stuff happens. There's a rebel army, liberation of an underclass, politics and drama, you name it. Oh, and remember my Mecha and War video? Remember that one? Where I mentioned that Voltes 5 was a cultural phenomenon in the Philippines. Boy, I wonder why that was. Probably the toys, right? Or, oh, wait, no, it was the fact that young Filipino people watching Voltes 5 identified with the main characters, fighting back against a tyrannical enemy, an enemy with some depth, who themselves had characters trying to overthrow a tyrannical government, just like their military dictatorship, which straight up banned Voltes 5. Thus, life paralleled art. By banning the show, the government became a mirror of the antagonists in the show, and Voltes 5 became a symbol of the politically active new generation of people. People who saw the protagonists and their giant robot as a symbol of resisting the tyranny, and thus galvanized their fight back against the same government in real life. Thus, the generation who came of age with Voltes 5 would later be instrumental in deposing Ferdinand Marcos from power in the 80s. The banning was happening basically side by side with the airing of Gundam in 1979.
But there's no politics in anime before Gundam. You know, if not the first real robot yeah, that's it, you got it. You're right.
Now, do I prefer Gundam as a show? Yes. But even within Mecha, the Zombies were not the first space fascist baddies. Their ugly space castle was not the first ugly space castle. And Zeon was not the first Garbaglabarblian space empire. So it wasn't so much that Gundam did a lot of stuff. Hell, most stuff first. Rather, like most pivotal works, what makes Gundam special is how it reworked, reincorporated, and artistically recombined those elements to a higher degree. The world Gundam tapped into in real life, and how it responded in turn. But yeah, basically, most of the ingredients were already out there. Perhaps it was just merely missing salt?
Yeah, well, still, it's not like, Gundam was like the first work where Tomino showed just how cool robots could be. That's it. That's gotta be it or something.
Well, actually, hold on. I'm pretty sure I killed you earlier. How the hell are you still alive?
Well, you see, I was bleeding on the ground, and then a giant mechanical robot thing, it was kind of like a vacuum cleaner, it kind of just sucked me up with a bunch of tubes.
Uh-huh.
The next thing I knew, here I am, I'm good as... Well, actually, I feel a little weird. I'm kind of bloated. Hold on. I don't feel...
Without Tomino, there's no Gundam. So it makes sense to rewind one last time and tell the story of Tomino. Then widen the cast a bit to see all those who would help make Gundam. Tomino, as mentioned previously, was born in 1941. Thus, like many Japanese in that generation, he and his father's story are intertwined with World War II. His father was a chemical engineer and photographer. During the war, his father, Kihei Tomino, sought to avoid the draft by working in a chemical product factory, specifically manufacturing rubberized cloth for use in military water tanks and waterproof aircraft skin. Towards the end of the war, as Japan grew desperate, he was drafted to serve in the Korean front, but the war ended before he could be deployed. One thing Tomino makes specific note of is that his father knew of other chemical engineers who suspiciously were promoted quite high up in the Japanese military. Specifically, Tomino mentions, "This is a story I heard from my father. Around 1943, when a soldier from the Army Chemical Research Institute, who was teaching chemical engineering at the same time as my father, returned from China, my father visited him and chatted with him. The soldier, who was a captain when he was teaching at the Chemical Engineering Institute, was now a major. At that time, I heard my father complain that he was conducting poison gas experiments, and that a technical officer, a technical soldier, could only really reach the rank of lieutenant. Of course, what Tomino means here is that his father was suspicious of the man's promotion. While he was growing up and after the war, Tomino felt very, very odd about this. I thought it was indescribable. There was no talk of chemical warfare or germ warfare at the time, and that soldiers only thought about career advancement. In the same way when I saw my father, who seemed to be feeling the same bitterness about 10 years after the war. It's unclear exactly how much Tomino's father knew about elements like the now infamous Unit 731, or the other chemical weapon testing programs which conducted human testing and experimentation. But Tomino seems to firmly believe his father had a lingering guilt of being so aware of some of the most inhuman acts of Japan in World War II. This is kind of interesting because in the same interview he compares him to Jiro Hirokoshi from Miyazaki's The Wind Rises. A sense of guilt over the involvement with the war. Very specifically the use of science and technological advancement in such an evil fashion and for such nationalist ends. It's not hard to think that Zeon's gassing of the colonies perhaps being influenced by this. During the war, Tomino's father even tested a protective rubberized suit. And then because his father was a photographer, these were albums that Tomino grew up with. Thus it's also not hard to draw some parallels between Amuro Ray and the relationship to his father, Temray. This weird mixing of fatherhood, technology, and war, especially when we remember that Dr. Kaneda in Tetsujin 28 Go was a scientist father passing the heirloom of technology to his son post-war. Tomino was thus familiar with pressurized suits at the childhood level. The spacesuits, he says, felt natural as a progression to him. Now, it may be a bit too obvious to think of this with the Gundam's mobile suits, normal suits, and so on, but at the same time it's easy to see that these elements could subconsciously filter down in Tomino's art. Tomino at the same time felt both his parents were well off enough not to have struggled too hard in life. He kind of critically describes them as, "I thought my parents were sloppy. Each of my parents' families was wealthy. My father's side was a large landowner in Oshima, in Tokyo, and my grandfather once served as the mayor of a local town. My mother's side of the family ran a factory in Oshima as well, and during the Taisho period, they were quite successful. That's why my parents are both just boys and girls." The translation is a little rough here, I will admit, but Tomino seems to suspect that neither of his parents were forced to mature due to their well-off nature. Tomino in turn wanted to break out academically and live on his own, to stand apart from his parents and their wealth. Here again, it's easy to draw parallels to Amuro's decisive moment of turning away from the comfort and childhood of his mother in Mobile Suit Gundam. However, Tomino sucked at math. Quote, "I completely failed mathematics when I was in junior high school." So this shifted him towards liberal arts. Tomino would apply and enter Nihon University's College of Arts. It was around this time when he started thinking about films. Tomino fondly remembered Destination Moon from 1950 as a movie from his childhood, but he wasn't satisfied with the characters or story. Quote, "The script is terrible anyways." Rather, what interested him was space as a setting for a more mature work, which he compares to and describes as literary fiction. This, to me, is pretty interesting. As an artist myself, I understand this lingering want. This idea of seeing something appealing in art, but feeling like you could tell just a different story if you could just pull it off. These ideas stick with artists for years, decades, lifetimes. We will come back to this likewise, so remember it. Tomino did not explicitly pursue animation at first. During university, he would study and was involved in a number of student films. He would also be involved in Nihon University's film clubs. 1 year senior to Tomino was Masao Adachi, a prominent radical leftist member and filmmaker. Tomino mentions, "I would become a leftist if I carelessly mixed in. In fact, when I saw him up close, I felt that kind of sharpness. If I had made a movie with him, I think I would have joined the Red Army and went to Asama Sanso." Asama Sanso was a 1972 radical Japanese leftist hostage crisis. I can't tell if Tomino is serious here or is being a bit dramatic. I mainly make note of this because this was the period where Tomino really brushed up against the heat of the growing Japanese student youth leftists. This would later have a lingering huge impact on his work, but we won't likely come back to this until the end of this initial Gundam series. In 1964, when he was 23, Mushi Productions, under Osamu Tezuka, was hiring. Tomino was looking for work as he was about to graduate, and his mother mentioned seeing a job posting in a newspaper. At the time, animation was still very nascent, and as such, even Tomino had no background beyond his liberal arts and film studies, but he was accepted as a production assistant. Over the next few years, though, Tomino would build on his skills, learning to direct and work with the limited animation style. As he says, "When you've done that, putting together a story visually is, to tell the truth, not a theory of the author or a work of art from a literary point of view, but rather a craftsman's job of figuring out how to stack up all the pieces. It turns out, not many people can do this. I wasn't really aware of it at the time, though." Tomino in general seems to constantly make note of this tension between making a story that can be approachable and one that can be consumable by all audiences. He felt at that time, "After that, when I was entrusted with an anime series, I was able to instinctively combine how to develop a story. I think that I was able to do the general directing of giant robot shows by noticing the methodology of not adding literary weight." Okay, now remember that thing about Destination Moon? Good. Because after quitting Mushi Productions, we were coming right back to it. He would try to do freelance commercial work in the very late 60s, and he would do art lectures as well. But during this period, a certain special work would come out. When I came to understand that film is basically a structure, what came to my mind was a silly movie like Destination Moon. I was vaguely thinking about how to put it together, to make it a serious literary work or not, and what it would be like at that point. Around that time, I quit Mushi Productions. An outrageous movie called 2001: A Space Odyssey came out. When I was suddenly shown that, I thought, yeah, this is it! Although this movie is thoroughly crap, it can be said that it is also thoroughly a masterpiece. Now, okay, I know that sounds a bit extreme at both ends, but you can see what Tomino means here with the tension I mentioned in mind. On one hand, 2001 was a landmark impressive work. It had an amazing level of technological realism baked into it. It had big ideas. It's a film that's very patient, intellectual, and nuanced. Its special effects were fantastic. They hold up even today, over 50 years later. I mean, for God's sake, people thought Kubrick faked the moon landing, partially because of how good 2001 sold its science fiction. Yet at the same time, Tomino, someone who had now had years of experience in commercial animation at Mushi Productions, knew it was dry. Many people even today would say it's boring, too long, or too passive to be engaging by a mass audience. So he also knew not just the level of mass media present, he literally helped direct and compose it. In some ways, no one else could be more aware of the opposite polar demands of serious complex fiction and mass consumer appeal, as he expands further from the same interview. What I came to understand was a kind of performing art was, I thought I shouldn't make it the way it was done in 2001. Then we have no choice but to create a story that everyone can understand how it was created. Otherwise, the production funds cannot be recovered. That's all there is to it. It goes without saying that movies are not basically just literary works. When I started working on TV animations at Mushi Productions, there was a process of building that kind of thing properly in me. Now I know it's easy to look at this and think, okay, Tomino is a heartless capitalist. Oh, woe is me. The toy fuckheads are right. But what he is clearly saying here is more so the idea of balancing and achieving a work that does say something, that has philosophy, but is also widely appealing, seen and enjoyed, and a commercial success. Likewise, once again, even Hayao Miyazaki, arguably one of the few other creators to be as titanic as Tomino in influence, has his famous, "When I think about how I haven't reached some people, I feel empty" quote. Animation is fundamentally an expensive, labor-intensive industry. Even works made with grants require capital to exist. And for those other works, for the vast majority of them, profits to justify its created existence. This is, to me, the other side of the stupidity of it's just a toy commercial as an argument. It's merely a fact of the production of art under the systems we live with. Balancing that demand with the intense desire to say something with your work is the challenge of being an artist. I say this as someone who just recently finished my first visual novel project and is in the process of self-promotion as a means to achieve this exact challenge. So perhaps, exactly because of this, maybe this was the motivation to quit Mushi Productions. However, just a short while later, Tomino, now mainly adjusted to studio work, would come back to work on Triton of the Sea in 1972, though not as a Mushi Productions staff member. However, Triton would be something more important. Tomino's directorial debut, Umi no Triton, which I directed for the first time. There was an original work by Mr. Tezuka, but I did the job of completely denying it. I haven't heard anything directly from Tezuka-sensei about this. However, there was a time when I was criticized by the people involved with Tezuka Productions. This would then lead to, in 1975, the first of 3 works which arguably then set Tomino on his launch schedule towards Gundam. For you see, back in 1972, a new studio formed. One that now exists as the core of perhaps the most dominant multimedia conglomerate in Japan. Though it was not called as such then. Studio Sunrise. Thus, in 1975, Brave Riding would be the first mecha work with Tomino as main series director, where he would direct the first half of the series. Riding would be interesting as Tomino felt experiencing being crushed as if I resisted the trend of the times. I do find it rather ironic that Gundam, a series which would later warp and bend the industry, and so many later careers around it, would have its creator feel himself crushed by the earliest trends. This then leads to the second step, and major one, for the launch of Gundam, Zambot 3 in 1977. The significance of Zambot is really multifaceted. Firstly, virtually every artist that works within a creative system usually has a turnover point, where their singular creative influence ticks over and becomes discernible and noticeable, after which they usually create a landmark breakout work that then cements their creative personality. We can see many examples of this. Satoshi Kon's early work on Mamoru Oshii's projects, culminating in what I feel to be a turnover point within Magnetic Rose, the short animated film from Otomo's memories. Kon would later follow with his breakout work Perfect Blue, which is 100% noticeably Satoshi Kon. Mamoru Oshii likewise had his turnover point with the Urusei Yatsura long-running anime. with his breakout being either the series' second movie, Beautiful Dreamer, or absolutely Angel's Egg, depending on where you want to draw the line. But it doesn't have to be a movie, though that kind of production helps down to its scale and focus. In contrast, Hideaki Anno, someone whose contributions to Gainax are undeniable in Gunbuster and Royal Space Force, really had both his turnover point and breakout be TV shows, namely in Nadia of Blue Water for the former and Evangelion for the latter. Of course, anime productions are huge projects, and I don't mean to lean too heavily into the auteur theory, but even working with producers, writers, and animators, I do feel there are strong works where a creator, such as Tomino in this case, shift from having just worked on something to very much having a sense of it be created by, as their creative decision-making becomes consistently prominent. While it is certain Tomino had an effect on writing, I feel confident in saying that Zambot 3, thanks in no small part to the fact Tomino directed the entirety of the series, constitutes his turnover point, building up to the eventual breakout with Mobile Suit Gundam. As he himself says, "After that, when I was given the chance to work on Invincible Chojin Zambot 3, I was told as long as the condition of a child riding a giant robot was being met, I could do anything behind the scenes. As I said, I tried many things. However, there were times when I was told later that I shouldn't have done that." Boy, I wonder what he was told he shouldn't have done. Oh right, the Human Bomb episode. Yeah, if you don't know already from my previous videos and jokes, Zambot 3 is a pretty brutal show. Nothing encapsulates that better than the episode where the villain's evil monster of the week has the ability to suck up people and turn them into walking bombs. Yeah, that's good children's entertainment. Another huge factor Tomino directly emphasized was the notable presence of collateral damage, something that would become a hallmark of his darker works going forward and Gundam. The simple addition of consequences for the titanic battles of the Hero Machine is absolutely indicative of his influence as a director, particularly his emphasis that convenient clean wars without death do not exist. Tomino also emphasized the importance of the elderly in a large family in Zambot 3. Not just a nuclear family or a crew of trained fighters or professional soldiers, but the concept of a family being there to support one another, and the support of grandparents in particular being vital to young people. It certainly isn't flashy, but you can see the beginnings of what would become very prominent inclusions, like the elderly civilian episodes of 0079. The series also ends pretty climactically with the death of 2 of the 3 main pilots and a whole bunch of other folks. And now Tomino, grim and evil, dark man he is. He was ready to kill everyone and everything. Haha, kill them all, Tomino. Aha, so funny, so funny. Only, that's stupid. And it's not really funny either. And it probably hasn't been for like 30 years. Because, what did Tomino direct directly after Zambot 3? Gundam? Nope. Dun dun! 1, 2, 3! Daitan 3! A fairly lighthearted series in stark contrast to Zambot. Basically, actually what most idiots that repeat the kill 'em all dead joke don't realize is Tomino's unstable gravitational rotation. As you can see here on this diagram, the audience, Tomino, and his art all orbit in an unstable 3-body gravitational cluster. So while it is true, Tomino will sequentially blot out the sun and be invoked to form a brooding contact with his audience, at other times, Tomino will achieve a stable and happy gumdrop chocolate smile period. Thus, for every Zambot 3, Ideon, Zeta, Dunbine, and Victory Dark eras, there is also prosperous and happy ages. Daitarn 3, Turn A, King Gainer, and G-Reco, Double Zeta, where oftentimes almost no characters will die at all. Well, save 1 or 2 baddies. So, Daitarn 3 was already in the works when Tomino was attached. Eiji Yamura pushed for it to be less emotionally big sad as a work. Tomino was unhappy with the obsession with mecha toys, but took this to heart and named the main character Banjo Haran, because he thought it would sound funny. Gags were a prominent feature, which also helped to lighten the tone, though Tomino somewhat regretted having to put quite so much effort into them. Tomino wanted to create a, quote, Charlie Chaplin-like atmosphere within the show. Trust me, as someone who will spend an entire day doing one joke in video editing, I sympathize immensely. Name aside, Banjo is significant as being voiced by Hirotaka Suzuoki, who would notably play Bright Noah in Mobile Suit Gundam. Yu Inoue, who voiced Reiko Sanjo, would also later go on to voice Sayla Mass, also of Mobile Suit Gundam. And, as I mention that now, it's a good time to pivot. Hey, remember 3 pages of script ago when I said, firstly? Okay, well now I can mention, secondly, that the other big important thing from the beginning of the section in relation to Zambot, Daitarn, Raiding, and Gundam is that they weren't obviously all created just by Tomino. In fact, many core members of the people who would go on to make Gundam and their production started working with Tomino beforehand. Thus, that's the second reason Zambot 3 is significant. And also that I can now show you in a nice big diagram. Ryoji Fujiwara, who also did mechanical design on Zambot 3, would then do likewise and unit direction and episode direction work on Daitarn 3. He would then go on to do mainly the direction side stuff for Mobile Suit Gundam. Many writing staff were also carried over. Hiroyuki Hoshiyama, who did script writing for Zambot 3 and Daitarn 3, would also do just that for Mobile Suit Gundam in 1979. Kenichi Matsuzaki, who wrote scripts for Daitarn 3, would also come back to work on Mobile Suit Gundam. He is also worth mentioning as the one who likely got Tomino a copy of Starship Troopers at some point. Yoshikazu Yasuhiko is another worth mentioning, as having worked extensively on Yamato, and done the character designs for Zambot 3. His style would simultaneously be made iconic by Gundam, and become very iconic in and of itself. Of course, I am a mecha man, so I can't not mention that Daitarn 3 would see Kunio Okawara doing mechanical design, returning now famously to do Gundam. These are just some of the prominent members I feel are worth mentioning, but if you go through Gundam's credit list, you can probably find more. What I do feel this shows is that having had multiple previous completed shows helped Tomino have a palette of experience and people to work with. Now, if I can play devil's advocate for a moment, to me, it does feel that the highly mecha-focused, iterative, rapid, consumerist nature of Japanese anime in the 1970s arguably helped Tomino and others practice and push themselves on various projects towards a point where they could make Gundam. Once again showing that Gundam was forged in lunar titanium directly from those works, not in spite of them as some idiots would have you believe. Tomino having already done a shocking show like Zambot 3, and a fun show like Daitarn 3, perhaps making him interested, and now moving on to a more mature and nuanced story. One that could balance mass appeal while still keeping him interested and creatively challenged, both to make back the production budget and to have some literary fiction. In space! Okay, so, we now know where Japan was in 1979. We know where the Japanese culture, anime, and mecha anime was, more or less, and now have a good idea of Tomino's creative balance, of somewhat begrudgingly making mecha series that had mass appeal, but then making them weird and interesting to keep it interesting to himself, and then also to try and challenge himself. We also have a good idea of some of the folks who worked on it all. In general, you should have a pretty good idea now for a sense of context. Jesus Christ, Argenbolt, the video's probably over like, oh my god, it's like an hour long already. You still haven't even answered your own question. Why do we still care? Okay, listen, I'm gonna level with you. I was always gonna have to do this at some point. Mobile Suit Gundam was the first, so it went in this one. Now don't worry, because the back half of the video is going to be nothing but Mobile Suit Gundam. And thank God, now you have a good picture of things. Argenbolt, where are we? Now, I don't need to do this for Zeta, Double Zeta, or Char's Counterattack. And I mean, there are like 50 friggin' Gundam series, most of which don't need anywhere near this much context in future. Argenbolt, what's that noise? Should we be standing here? They will need, maybe like 10 to 5 minutes of context each maximum, just enough to bridge one series to the next. Also now, Tomino, so I don't need to do this section again for like Ideon, or Zibungle, or King Gainer. Should I want to make videos on this at some point? Oh, Argenbolt, do you not hear that? I think we really need to get out of here like right now. I think we're under a launch blast. On April 7th, 1979, the first episode of Mobile Suit Gundam would air on Nagoya Broadcasting Network. From the very start, we can see what everything is built up to. Just like in 2001, the sun dawns around the shadow of the Earth, and just like how 2001 signaled the dawn of humanity with its intro, Gundam's is signaling the start of something new. I won't comment too much on the animation as I have a section coming up for just that, but we do get a nice sense here. We see our main cast, get nice shots of the mecha doing their thing. Where Gundam really begins though, and perhaps where best to focus on the first section of the actual review, is on the now legendary intro. So much is perfectly contained within this intro, it's kind of hard to understate. The genius here really isn't the lore dump itself, plenty of stories use this. All the way from serious fiction and hard science fiction to equally now famous serial adventures intros of Star Wars and its forefathers. No, what sets Gundam apart is the simplicity and combination of elements. This is, by most SF standards, a very strangely near-future and believable war, not taking place across planets and stars light years away, but being essentially an entirely local conflict. The Earth, the Moon, and the gigantic space colonies in orbit. Where so many other science fiction stories want to leap out into the depths of the cosmos, go faster than light. The simple locality of this setup feels both very within reach and grounded. Earth's population crisis driving the Federation government to construct space colonies, moving resource asteroids from the belt around the Earth to mine and construct said space colonies. The Moon is inhabited by multiple large cities itself, and around the Earth a vast network of space infrastructure exists. All of which leading to Side 3, Zeon, then attempting to break away and in the process of fighting the Federation, destroy and conquer the other Lagrange Point colony clusters. All of this being laid out as early as 1978's series-setting guide. What makes this only more astonishing was how recent in time this was. The colonies depicted in Gundam were only really visually and technically proposed just a few years prior. The High Frontier had human colonies in space being written by Dr. Gerard K. O'Neill only 3 years before Gundam in 1977. O'Neill is a fascinating person himself, but to so quickly incorporate his ideas, in an era before the internet, and in Japan across a language barrier, shows something important. So, to answer, why do we still care about Gundam, I have come up with 6 key pivotal points. This is the start of the first. Mobile Suit Gundam is significant for so clearly using an incredibly honed sense of technical relative realism as a work of science fiction. What is relative realism? It's a concept I talked about in my Destruction of Mecha video, but to quickly summarize. Relative realism is the ability for a work of fiction to create a believable and grounded world and story out of real-life science. Like 2001 before it, Gundam made extensive use of this to connect and anchor its world in conflict and plot. The insistence on no magic gravity, only using rotating areas. The little railings and handles and thingies they hang onto to get around in zero gravity. Use of spacesuits for the pilots and for spacecraft crews. Something that seemingly took most SF decades to implement later on first appear here. Even the mobile suits themselves benefit from this. I'll get into the military history in a section dedicated to them in a bit, but for now though, the scientific relative technical realism lends them the other big half of their credibility when you think about it. You are building these gargantuan space colonies using heaps of space construction machines. The obvious thing to bring up is the Ball mobile worker, here definitely taking absolute inspiration from 2001's worker pods. So service areas and the construction zones abound. Like Patlabor's labors being grounded in the Japanese Reconstruction and economic boom of the 80s, the mobile suit's partial origin in the construction boom of space feels cool and right. After all, space will create new methods of construction and vehicles for it, so weaponizing them isn't as much of a leap, then specialization of that weaponization. This marries the technological wonders and backdrop of these O'Neill colony cylinders, these gigantic, gargantuan, tens of kilometers long and wide miniature worlds, with the gargantuan technological wonder of the mobile suit. Tomino's love of space and spacesuits, I think, really impacted and created this. Now here, I have to admit, I failed a bit. One of my goals with this video was to concretely nail down things I've heard about 0079 for years, but, could never really source. I really wanted to find either, myself or with help from Kanan or Morlock, an interview or a book or something that firmly had a staff member on Gundam mention Dr. O'Neill's The High Frontier. The timeline is simply too tight for it to have been any other possibility. The High Frontier being translated into Japanese in 1977 as Space Colony Island, built by 1990, and Gundam's production and setting really getting fleshed out in 78. Sadly, while I can't say absolutely this is the work that inspired Gundam, I, even now, cannot trace an exact causal link. But Tomino and Kenichi Matsuzaki were both very well-read science fiction fans. Kanan theorized that Tomino may have come up with the space colonies idea, but it was Matsuzaki who proposed the, link, and for Tomino to read the O'Neill construction cylinder design concept from the High Frontier. I do think I have to agree Tomino and Matsuzaki are the likeliest links here, Tomino's early interest in SF really playing a big role. Also, on a fun side note, because O'Neill would use names like Island 3 to refer to his designs, here the Japanese becomes Uchu Shokumin Shima, or literally Space Colony Island, using the same kanji Shima as normal Earth islands. But this only really addresses the technical side of things. Of course, the other side is the war and its politics. As mentioned previously, Mecha has already approaching more and more complexity in its villains. What tips over with Gundam here, though, is that once again, the grounded nature of it. Zeon's independence from Earth is weirdly historical. It's evocative of real-life events like the American War of Independence, of a colony power growing and seeking to expand with newfound military and political might. Indeed, going back much further, the Roman Empire was in part founded from colonies founded by the Magna Graecia, the ancient Greek colonies, but it eclipsed Greece handily with enough time. One of their big rivals from the Punic Wars, Carthage itself, was initially a colony of the Phoenician civilization that outgrew its parent powers. And not to get too Eurocentric, even Japan itself, a country obviously founded and populated by human settlers from mainland Asia, was also hugely influenced and secondary to ancient China, but eventually grew to become an expansionist imperial power, which at least in the early 1900s was more powerful. And this is why context is important. With it, we can see that even with fantastical futuristic concepts like multi-kilometer long space colonies, Zeon is also extremely historically grounded. It's a weird combination of the US and Japanese history projected onto the future of space. We are also shown the scale and the suffering of the war, the devastation of the colony drop, once again made all the more personal by its threat and consequence to our very Earth. The destruction of colonies and the loss of billions of lives. Right away, Episode 1 is a perfect, hectic, and tense introduction, starting with a now equally iconic introduction of the Zaku's approaching the colony. This is the closest Gundam it really ever gets to the true silence of space. However, I won't tell you exactly how this translates to the third reason why we care about Gundam right now. I know this seems abrupt because we're missing something important. The second reason. The characters. What makes a story and not merely a historiography is characters. And Gundam has some really great characters. Amuro Ray and Char Aznable. These two characters are essentially the core of the Universal Century. And when thinking about how to plan out my review of Gundam, this initial 4-part series focusing on them felt perfect. These two are so unquestionably the core of UC that most modern series have to appeal back to them in some fashion. It is funny how much is packed into a mere 24 minutes. We are instantly shown Amuro's personality. Introverted, interested in machines. Tomino's characters in Zambot 3 were already grappling with the weight of their responsibility in piloting the titular mecha while also being so young. Amuro here is a natural progression of that. He's even less well equipped and less ideal as a basis for a pilot. But that is also functionally what makes him appealing. Amuro is very believable as a slightly shy and machine-minded person. He has the potential there, but he really is an amazing natural super pilot by default. But that's just the start. We also see Frau Bo's doting motherly concern that will bloom into her care and endurance over the war. Tem Ray, Amuro's father, is also presented to us. Tem Ray here takes the eccentric super scientist father creator of mecha and really moves it in a very neat and grounded direction. You can so easily see his workaholic, project-obsessed nature come through as things that obviously impacted and shaped Amuro. Tem Ray sees completing his project, the creation of the Gundam, as having the potential to end the war and spare youth like Amuro from fighting. Like many job-obsessed Japanese fathers during Japan's economic boom, having scarce time for their children, but directly at times perhaps working so hard, specifically to spare their children from the hardships they faced rebuilding Japan after the war, sadly causing the neglect as a side effect of their well-meaning pursuit. We also see our first introduction of Char, the deuteragonist and later final antagonist of our story, an ace pilot of Zeon hiding behind a samurai mask, a character I adore for his conflicted and complex nature. But I won't comment on Char just yet, not until a slightly later section. The Zeon forces attack, Amuro is beckoned to pilot Gundam, Tem Ray is sucked into space. By the end of the first 24 minutes, Frau Bow has seen most of her family die. Once more, continuing off of Zambot 3, Gundam emphasizes the destructive consequences of war as a violent time, a time of severe pain and loss. Amuro finds the Gundam manual by chance, activates the RX-78, and is killed as first human in armed conflict. Then his second, starting him down a path he cannot possibly imagine. Already, Amuro has learned that careless violence with the nuclear power of the mobile suit can be disastrous. Thus we conclude Episode 1 and have seen in a nutshell almost all the underlying themes Gundam will tackle. War, the consequences of war, adolescence, and the larger technological and political forces causing the conflict. The futuristic space colonies, as well as their still vulnerable fragility in the face of that war. The next 4 episodes make up the first arc of the show. From the launch of the Gundam to re-entry to Earth, what we see is a further expansion on these themes. The White Base, the main ship and the vehicle from our series, escapes Side 7. But the crew is noticeably not professional adults and soldiers, the attack on Side 7 having killed or injured most of them. Here, Gundam is directly shoving youth into the front line, taking a page from Space Battleship Yamato and going even further. This always strikes me as very weird when some Gundam fans insist that Gundam should be about adult pilots and soldiers. The 1978 Gundam setting notes explicitly list the themes of intense battles, adolescence of a boy, and survival. It's just so fundamentally core to the idea of Gundam. The meeting point of these bright, toy-like visual appeal, but also the brutality of war. Of the vulnerability of youth surviving conflict into adulthood. In many ways, it's very similar to the appeal of something like Battle Royale. It was a sensation that filled me holding my cousin's small RX-78 all those years ago. However, unlike even Yamato, Captain Bright Noah is not an adult. In fact, it's astoundingly easy to forget over the series just this simple fact. Bright, the steadfast rock, a fixed point who keeps the crew of teenagers together, he himself is only 19 years old, and Ryu is only 18, fat Albert looking ass. I know it's funny because younger kids look up to 19-year-olds as basically being an adult. What this means is that even Bright has really only had at most a year of real adulthood and military training. As someone myself a good bit older than Bright now, I can firmly say even the most mature 19-year-old is basically still only the youngest adult and is pretty much just the oldest teenager. This extends as well to Char. Char is at best merely someone in their mid-20s. So neither the true protagonists of the White Base, Amuro, Sayla, Bright, Mirai, Kai, most of the pilots and crew, nor even the deuteragonist and antagonist are really all that old. Char has more experience, that much is true, but like only just. This is brought out wonderfully where Char and Amuro fight to a standstill. Amuro's inexperience being saved by the Gundam's armor, and the technological advantage in spite of Char's better tactics and piloting. Thus, running from Char's pursuit to the resource asteroid Luna 2, the youth comes into direct conflict with adults and the war they caused. Bright has essentially become the leader of the White Base, but Admiral Walken still refuses to recognize him and the other White Base crew as such. Even trying to warn them as such does little, and eventually Bright and Amuro take things into their own hands. Walken's stubbornness causes the loss of his fancy Magellan-class ship, and in the end, both the Magellan and Captain Paolo are lost, opening the way for the White Base and the Gundam. Char really isn't much better off, also desiring supplies from the losses the Gundam has inflicted. Char and his Musai is resupplied by Gadam and his Papua-class resupply ship. The reason I bring this up is not to summarize, but I want to draw pretty direct attention to what Gundam is doing here. What I love about this is twofold. Firstly, as I've talked about previously, the logistical realism is added here, forcing both sides to consider losses, supplies, and repairs. It is carried out throughout the series. And secondly, timeline-wise, this makes no friggin' sense. Gadam is clearly this mustache-aged gentleman. He uses a Zaku 1 and tries to make this point about, "I'll teach you what, Sonny Jim," like this old-timer. But even Gundam's earliest notes had that the mobile suit, Zeon's independence, and the war are all very recent events. Most of them happened within just 5 to 10 years previous. Gadam and Char have about as much mobile suit experience. Both lived through the development and employment of this machine. So chronologically, it's total bullshit, but that's not the point. The point is to do what I already said. Both the allies and the enemies are running into conflict with adulthood. Literally. The new young characters and their new young machines are running into issues with adults and their old machines. It's perfect. And it's here that we get our second reason. Why do we still care about Gundam? Number 2. Gundam used well-fleshed out and diverse cast of youth, thrust in the conflict of war, which allowed the Japanese youth watching, and us today, to project onto the notion of being involved in such a war and wanting to survive. And that can be appealing regardless of decade. The drop down to Earth then begins shortly thereafterwards. There's a little scene here I adore where Amuro's just talking to this old man. So much is encapsulated here. The old man taking care of the young child reminds me of Zambot 3 a lot. But it also helps establish that Amuro's tense fight and what he needs to defend with these civilian lives. Once more, the technical realism of re-entry and its danger is being used to add tension and stakes to the plot. Whereas in so many science fiction, even Western science fiction, crafts seamlessly exit and enter planets, even works aspiring to realism like Interstellar and The Expanse are guilty of having Star Wars level shuttles that can just make this hazard second thought. So Gundam here in 1979 is using it to conclude its first arc. It's really good. It's a ticking clock of survival against the inferno of re-entry. Also, Gundam Hamada! And Gundam re-entry condom, duh. Hey, so it's a super technology for sure, but I mean, most Western science fiction just have magic friggin' shield. The white base survives re-entry, and the civilians look down at the Earth they will soon reunite with. But Garmazabi has contacted Char, and so we move into Gundam's second arc, and I think it's time I stop delaying and tell you the subtle and nuanced third reason why we should still care that I hinted at before. Functionally, of course, something as simple as youth in conflict is appealing. But obviously enough, Gundam is not Battle Royale. It's not even quite the same as previous mecha shows. So what about it set it apart? From here on out, the reason why we care will be very specific to Gundam, at the point it was released, and will get more complex. The third reason, as the white base fights its way across America and against Garmazabi, is basically an expansion of the second reason. That is the nature of its conflict, the 1-year war. This is one of the big reasons Gundam was a landmark work, and still is. It is now time, once more, to return to Space Battleship Yamato briefly, because that is very much the foundation Gundam develops from. In Yamato, the Gamalus Empire, like many villains in mecha at the time, is coded in the uniforms of Imperial power. Even its leader, with its alien blue skin, still has blonde hair, and, a uniform that kind of tells you everything. But this poses a strange identity of the protagonists then, because they're flying through space in the Yamato, the symbol of greatness of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the largest battleship ever. So what's going on? The simple answer here is that, as we see in the opening episodes of Yamato, it is reborn. The human cast, while mainly portrayed as Japanese, represent the UN Cosmo Navy, in essence the United Nations of Earth. So, really, what is happening here? How does it relate to Gundam? The answer then is really quite simple. Yamato's war, and Gundam's by extension, is the battle between Japanese identity and itself. The new, neoliberal, democratic, capitalist Japan, a United Nations member, against its old imperial, also kind of capitalist, authoritarian history. But it is what Gundam changes that draws us out further. Firstly, as mentioned before, Zeon is not the old power of Earth, it's the new rising power of space. And what takes this further than Voltes is that Zeon are firmly, completely human. It's hard to understate how major this is. Even huge, long-running Western science fiction works like Star Trek use stand-in aliens like the Klingons or Cardassians or Romulans to represent militaristic and imperial powers. The good guys, the Federation, are mainly humans. They're an extension of Western culture, and the West, the US, won World War II. Japan, however, did not. Thus, as a defeated imperial power made into a new Western state, there's a crisis of identity, there's a double identity. Unlike the US, which can look back on the glories of its victory in that war, Japan had to look back in shame. The location as well is vital to Gundam. Therein lies the second level as to why this works so well. The Earth. In setting the war squarely on Earth, or in space around Earth, and then using major battles and concepts from World War II, our future war set in the Universal Century, 0079, is grounded in pretty firm military history. Ramba Ral seems all too eerily inspired by the Desert Fox Rommel. an enemy commander the Allies were happy to turn into a sympathetic but tragic model leader of the Axis in their fight in North Africa. Rommel's hit-and-run approach almost perhaps feels too perfect an inspiration for the Goof's battles with the Gundam. Odessa's battle being evocative of the Western Front, of a huge clash over natural resources vital to the war. Or much later with the asteroid battles around Solomon and later Albaoku, where the brutal losses being inspired by the blood and violence of the Pacific island hopping campaign. And this isn't just relegated to events, even in the mechanical design, though overlooked often, shows this. The Musai, the main ship of Zeon, with its pagoda mast-like profile and stacked beam cannons, is directly evocative of IJN ships like the Nagato, Yamato, and Kongo. In stark contrast, after World War II, the usefulness of artillery was dwarfed by missiles, so many post-war ships opted for the new modern, single-barrel, rapid-fire deck gun, along with box launchers for anti-ship and anti-submarine and anti-air missiles. Wow! Look at the Salamis! What do you see? Starting to get the picture? This is also seen in the color theory as well. Salamis has a stark and modern military gray-blue with the red trim, inspired no doubt by the anti-rust paint on modern ships. In contrast, the Musai and a lot of Zeon craft are painted in green, that being a prominent color of the Imperial Japanese Force and Navy. Of course, the Magellan is kind of green and has guns, and Zeon has some much other very weird stuff, but generally speaking, there's kind of an obvious pattern. Zeon's uniforms are militaristic and imperial. Note how Char and Cassilia's laser rifle thing here is meant to evoke probably like a cavalry saber, their helmets being both samurai-like but also imperial. The Federation has, in stark contrast, relatively modern and kind of contemporary, kind of simple, clean outfits. The default gray, brown, kind of being more tied to American uniform design than the flamboyantly Prussian Zeon. Really only the vibrancy of the red, blue, yellow flares on the Federation uniforms distinguish them as anything more than post-World War II US designs. But character designer Yasuhiko basically says as much bluntly. Regarding the costumes, I tried to add some fun touches. I felt the Federation uniforms would seem unappealing if the colors were too military-like. So I went with a 19th century French tricolor-inspired palette. In contrast, I gave the Zeon uniforms that were more traditional coloring, hoping to evoke the image of pre-war Germany, less Nazi and more Prussian. Even their weapons sort of follow this pattern. Laser cavalry carbines aside, the Zeon use pistols clearly inspired by a German Luger, and rifles that at times look very much like just a modernized STG-44, also of World War II German origin. However, this also extends to, that's right, architecture! The Earth Federation's fortress of Jaburo is no doubt inspired by the post-World War II 1950 to 1960s construction of Brasilia in Brazil. A brand new capital made from scratch in the jungle. At the same time, burying it underground is absolutely the right move to survive a catastrophic space war. So once again, Gundam's commitment to technical realism shines through. In contrast, while being built in a futuristic space colony, Zeon's palace is a giant, gaudy, ugly imperial statement, from the throne room to just about everything. So in basically multiple avenues, the nature of the 1 Year War, in machines, weapons, uniforms, architecture, is one soaked in this idea, the conflict of history, of authoritarian World War II power and liberal democratic post-war power. It draws heavily from World War II, but it isn't only World War II, though it certainly has more World War II per pound than lightweights like Star Wars. Once again, the inversion here of making Zeon the rising power and the Federation the stagnant power also can't be understated. This jumps ahead to a time where liberal democracy has seemingly united the Earth, and yet a nascent power seeks to instead progress through authoritarianism? And keeping with the contrast between the two local factions, to a Japanese audience this created a compelling conflict and our third reason why we care. Number 3. Gundam used the bloody, grounded history of World War II and the post-war transformation of Japan to show young Japanese youth a war between modern neoliberal capitalist Japan and their old, expansionist imperial past. This is an incredibly compelling conflict, one more founded in history than Star Wars and more human and direct than the metaphors of Star Trek. One that needed to come from an imperial power defeated in World War II, then rebuilt by the West. Now, unfortunately, that doesn't answer something else. Why did I, a Westerner born over a decade later, why do Westerners in general care? This is compelling stuff for sure, but I'm going to hold out until the end of this section. For now, let's talk about and return to the White Base as another example. The naming of the White Base with another name, the Trojan Horse, by the Zeon also seems eerily similar to the World War II US carriers, specifically the USS Enterprise. Like the White Base in the One-Year War, the Enterprise was present in almost every major battle of the Pacific. It earned the most battle stars of any ship in World War II. It was the first US ship to sink a Japanese ship after Pearl Harbor, and most relevant to us, the Japanese announced her destruction no less than 3 times, earning the ship the nickname the Grey Ghost. If any World War II ship directly inspired the White Base, this seems the best bet. I mean, for God's sake, they still have manned anti-aircraft gun on the nuclear future spaceship. Get those 40mm Bofors firing! Now I know what you're thinking. Wait, Enterprise? Do you mean... Yes, dear viewer, once again, while the name would go on to become iconic in a Western science fiction ship, Gundam, once more, has more World War II per centimeter cubed in it than more actual history-inspiring events than most true blue American science fiction. This isn't really a surprise either. As Tomino himself said in several interviews, he was pulling on inspiration from Italian and Japanese neo-realist war films. These works are very interesting as both Italian and Japanese film industries post-war were much smaller budget and studio-wise than Hollywood. This then focused their cinema into a style that was very personal and grounded, while the bombastic US war movies were more big-budget and spectacle-driven. Tomino in particular mentioned such works as Vacuum Zone from 1952 as an example. Thus, once again, World War II, but specifically a post-war, post-loss narrative style from Japan and Italy as a defeated power shaped and added a ton of character to 0079's story, characters, and plot. Continuing on, as they were forced to descend to Earth off target and have re-entered in Zeon-held territory, the territory of Garmazabi, the youngest of the Zabi family that controls Zeon, the battles here are an interesting continuation of what I've just laid out. Aircraft played a devastatingly powerful role in World War II. The American entry into World War II was ushered by Japanese carrier aircraft attacking Pearl Harbor. So the GA, while its name and design are goofy, seems an extension of that. A flying, nuclear-powered super aircraft carrier. Were this another series, this would be a super weapon all to its own. As Tomino himself said, "My only memory of the war is that I fled to an air raid shelter during an air raid. In that air raid, many people died on both sides of the other 3 houses. After the war was over, the B-29 flying over Odawara was beautiful and cool. Because of the thoughts of those times, the post-war Japanese were able to persevere." The GA's design likely was either inspired directly or in part by Future Boy Conan's Gigant, or perhaps directly inspired by what inspired the Gigant, the Me-323, the largest military transport plane of World War II used by Nazi Germany. So you get this kind of triple-layer irony of North America in Mobile Suit Gundam was conquered by Zeon via flying nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, the symbol of US dominance after the war, but with a design based on German heavy aircraft design. In another way, though, World War II also imparted us with the notion of the power of the aircraft, but also the lingering coolness of ships with guns. It's definitely stuck around. Now, if only the two could meet, a kind of like aircraft carrier, a battleship, a star of battle, an almost battle star. Okay, I'm joking, but only just a bit. Functionally, the Battlestar Galactica and the White Base are more or less the same concept expressed a little differently as a point of pop culture convergence. The all-in-one assault ship. Able to launch and carry aircraft, but able to retain the coolness and ability to shoot big guns. As Battlestar Galactica came out in 1978, I'm not even saying one copied another. Rather, that both responded to a similar notional concept that was appealing. Wait, on either side of the Pacific? In both the US and Japan? Well, either way, the GA fighting against the White Base is, as you can see, essentially the battle between the two successor ideas of World War II. The flying aircraft carrier and the carrier battleship, duking it out. It's also during this arc where we get the first impression that Char might have ulterior motives he isn't showing. We also get the legendary Bright Noah slap, Amuro, while being forced to initially fight at Side 7, is now showing signs of regret and depression at his actions. The function of the second arc is really to show his initially repressed doubts and anxieties bubble up, given him enough time to do so. Char flawlessly manipulates someone who trusted him as a friend. Nicely done, Char. In the ruins of New York City, we get some great ground warfare between the mobile suits and urban cover. In the end, Garma is betrayed by Char and is annihilated by the White Base. Episode 11 then pivots heavily. For the first time, we see the entirety of the Zabi family, the ruling group, coming together. Dozle, who is brash but direct, and Gihren and Kycilia, who are more conniving and manipulative. With Degwin Zabi, the despot, oligarch, and father and ruler of Zeon. The episode also shows Isolina, a character easily overlooked who wants to take revenge for Garma's death, as she loved him. It seems odd just how willing to go along with, all this stuff that Zeon soldiers are. But then you gotta remember one of the core aspects of Gundam is young people in conflict, and then it kind of fits. There's a big point here to showing Isolina die at the end, and have Amuro notice this so directly. At last, at least some of the civilians can evacuate White Base. This leads to another pivotal episode, the threat of Zeon. The aforementioned Rama-Ral makes his first appearance, and his ship, the Zanzibar class, is essentially Zeon's equivalent to the White Base. A battleship carrier capable of atmospheric entry and movement. Yet this is also the PTSD Amuro episode. Now, this next part might blow you away, but humans actually need to be pretty preconditioned quite a bit to accept repeated intense violence. This is actually one of the functions of military training and indoctrination. So Amuro, even with fairly reasonable justification of protecting his friends and civilians, has, through repeated battle, basically become scarred, down to his background as, just being a teenage kid. Of course, the White Base crew understood and kind of, they provide Amuro with strong support, counseling, antidepressant. Nope! They stick his little battle-scarred ass in the cockpit and they launch him. They are stuck, damaged in enemy territory. Okay, Argenbold, but how are you going to relate that? Much like how many major wars, not the least of which World War II, the psychological trauma of those who fought was steamrolled over. War won't wait. The White Base has no other option. Amuro comes face to face with Rama-Ral. After several episodes where Amuro has handily become able to take down Zaku's, Ral and his goof have basically reset Amuro right back to square one. Thankfully, Ryu and Hayato bail him out. But what really underlines this episode, what the Gundam fans really out there know is coming, is Giren's speech at Garma's funeral. The now famous Zeon is exhausted. This speech ties directly back into what I laid out at the start of this section, and was partially the reason for talking about this now. This speech singularly achieves multiple things. Of course, it goes without saying that it's evocative of multiple historic speeches. From allies and enemies, from Churchill's "We will fight on the beaches," Patton's speech to the Third Army, Stalin's plethora of war speeches, and so on, it grounds Zeon in a real-life military history. At the same time, it fleshes out the world, emphasizing just how Clausewitz hauntingly wrote, "War is a politics by other means." The Zeon, like World War II Japan, see themselves and their resource and manpower disadvantage as being inconsequential. They see the war, a war which has destroyed billions of lives and scarred the Earth, as a just war. But it also does a third exceptional thing via the first two. It is something I've been hinting at in this section up until now, and will finally lay out here. Why do I, Argenbolt, decades after this episode released, on June 23rd, 1979, still give a shit? Why do I care? Mobile Suit Gundam was made in the shadow of World War II, as most 20th century history was. Japan was moving through a period dominated by liberal, democratic reconstruction, and after 1990, the world seemed on track to a universal century. With the fall of the USSR, it seemed liberal, capitalist democracy had won, history had ended. But as we now know, not to be too surprised, history doesn't end. 30 years on, authoritarianism hasn't vanished, in fact. It's just as dangerous. It's maybe even more dangerous. Strongmen political leaders like Gihren or Putin or Trump have not lost their appeal. Neither have nationalism, died out, been left to the dust of history either. Even Japan, in spite of all the tragedy and loss of World War II, has neo-nationalism to contest with. Indeed, even with violent wars of conquest, of which World War II is still the largest, also haven't vanished, just as the idealism of the 90s falsely predicted. The current battles in Ukraine have shown just that. The Battle of Odessa in Gundam in 1979 is a clear historical nod to World War II, but the current Russian missile attacks on Odessa in 2022 show history to be tragically alive and pretty bloody cyclical at times. So in 1979, by making Zeon the space-dwelling futuristic society, but also the Imperial one, they effectively projected the cycle forward to a point years in the future. We live, perhaps not in an era just as unified as the Universal Century, but still largely dominated by liberal, capitalist democracies. Democracies struggling with corruption and internal decay, just like the Federation. This is the simple genius of Mobile Suit Gundam's one-year war, and of the Universal Century. Now would also be a good time to mention the genius of just the UC in UC, because in making Gundam's timeline not set at a singular date, like 2198 or 2202 or 2450 whatever, the Universal Century becomes a floating point. Okay, sure, the technology can age, computers can look antiquated and so on, but the political and ideological core of Gundam and its future have remained as painfully relevant now as they were in 1979. And now I will give you the full scope of the third reason why we care about Gundam. Now that you know. Number 3. Gundam used the bloody and grounded history of World War II and the post-war transformation of Japan to show young Japanese youth a war between their modern neoliberal capitalist Japan and their old expansionist imperial past. But, more than that, because the West shares that history of World War II, albeit from the other side, and because we share the neoliberal postmodern world, that same appeal endures as well for fans outside of Japan. Further, as the core of the political message and tragedy of war have sadly not vanished, in spite of the end of history, so too has Gundam's politics and war remained as painfully relevant as ever. Damn, Argon! That's some pretty heavy stuff! Are you sure it's really that strongly appealing? Are you sure there's enough shared history and modern culture to make it true? Yes! And I will prove it!
Prove it? How?
By ending this section defending arguably the slowest part of the series, including, yes, Doan's Island, and even the Salt episode.
He's gone mad.
Episode 13 through 18 may very well be, yes, the slowest part of the series. After such monumental episodes as the threat of Zeon, Char isn't present, the White Base is essentially just fending off attacks and putt-putting around, fighting against Ramba Ral, even Amuro just kind of runs away from the plot. But in spite of all that, even at its weakest, all of this arc is still functionally a solid expression of one aspect or multiple of Gundam as I've just laid out. Coming Home presents Amuro with essentially one final choice to cast off his traumatic responsibility as taken on, attempting to find his mother who lives on Earth. It's a natural instinct after the trauma to perhaps seek out a simpler time and the compassion of a parent. In the end though, Amuro's decision to drop his childhood toy, to fight the abusive soldier, his decision to fire on the Zeon scouts, he has decided to move forward into adulthood, and him turning away from his mother in childhood is an impactful message of accepting the trauma and responsibility of adulthood. It certainly reminds me of Tomino's desire to leave the comfort of his well-off parents and earn his place in the world. At the same time, there's a bit of tragedy to Amuro's mother and her sadness at the level and proficiency of violence Amuro shows. But this is a time of war. Time Be Still presents another episode with an interesting story. Once again takes an opportunity to humanize the Zeon grunt soldiers. It's also the first notable appearance of Lieutenant Matilda. Especially, I really love the subtle tension between Frau and Amuro shown here. It might seem easy to wipe away interpersonal drama in the face of a larger threat, but Frau's subtle jealousy at Amuro and his crush on Matilda reminds us that even in times of war, the human heart waits for no one. The combined arms attack of the Zaku luring the Gundam into the forest, only for hoverbike infantry to plant demolition charges, is also great. The technical and military realism of a very World War II anti-tank technique. Doan's Island, an episode derided for its notably off-model animation, also keeps these trends. Sure, the machinery might be off-model, the animation is janky as hell at all times, but the underlying story is still very much hitting all the same points. The notion of a Zeon soldier abandoning his war to try and rebuild a life with orphan survivors. In some way it feels like the closest Mobile Suit Gundam gets to being Miyazakian. The irony that this is perhaps the most, complained about episode in the West, and it would get an entire tie-in movie is kind of sublime. And, yes, Sayla's agony. the equally infamous Salt episode. Okay, firstly, Bright eats a burger. More importantly, salt is the only mineral humans directly need to eat to stay healthy. Furthermore, the word salary, as in payment, also derives from salt, as in salarium, which was the amount of salt given to a Roman soldier as a monthly pay instead of coinage. No, God, please. Furthermore, U.S. Civil War General William Tecumseh Sherman once said, "Salt is eminently contraband because of its use in curing meats, without which armies cannot be subsisted." The destruction of the Confederate salt works at Moore-Meade City, North Carolina, being a strategic victory for the Union. Okay, please, enough, stop, please. Furthermore, in the Hebrew Bible, the noun melah, salt, has a link to the word for war, milchama, linked to the root word lacham, meaning destruction or consumption. Indeed, even Bethlehem, Jesus' birthplace, means place of food/bread. Please stop. Please, enough! Even in the atomic era, the salting of nuclear warheads with additional isotopes, enhancing their radiation output. This is from both the adding of additional elements, or salting, and the idea to salt the earth, a practice in ancient times to add salt, to sterilize, and destroy cities and farmland. We get it! We're sorry, okay, please, enough! So shut up about the salt episode. Salt is inexorably linked to war. You don't know what you're talking about. Oh, and also Sayla tries to pilot the Gundam, attempting to figure out if Char is her long-lost brother. But she fucks up in Descent of the Brig. We also get our first hint of Operation Odessa. Amuro deserts is then a nice thematic follow-up. Amuro attempts to fall back on his more introverted technical nature to use simulation to predict battle and train. But when Ramba Ral's attack and skill outmatch him, he's still proven to be outclassed. Mirai and Bright speak about their doubt that Amuro can make the best use of the Gundam, but Amuro overhears them, and he's very distraught at this that his comrades don't have confidence in his new adult identity as a pilot, so he deserts. Zeon's secret mind shows that Zeon's resource issues have driven them to exploit the Earth Federation's resources. Frau and Amuro argue as Frau implores Amuro to return to the White Base. Amuro attacks and is basically single-handedly responsible for destroying the Zeon mine operated by M'Quve, Cassilia's loyal Zeon military leader on Earth. But Amuro is frustrated by the scale of the war outstripping even his victory here. At the end, Amuro has a great moment with a wounded Zeon soldier. He basically spells it out for him. He can't pull his punches if he expects to survive. Thus, we can close out on this section on one of the more interesting episodes, Ramba Ral's attack. And I can mention and end on something very important before we move on. As you may have noticed, the period of battles on Earth here is pinned through what is a very good running theme that sets it apart from the later epic battles and earlier dogged pursuit of Char. What sets it apart is the strange focus and emphasis, to some viewers, it puts on repeatedly humanizing Zeon. It is hilarious to me that the Gundam novel opted to cut out the entirety of this. And sadly, another reason the movies are kind of inferior to the series thematically, despite being superior in animation quality at times. From Doan to the Zeon Grunt in Time Stands Still, the Dying Soldier in Zeon's Secret Mind, and then in this episode, Ramba Ral and his partner Haman. For a period many Gundam fans complain about, this period is driven through by these human moments amongst war. Now, certain, I will be polite, very stupid, simple-minded idiots here complain that Gundam is clearly saying Zeon is actually the good guys. After all, outside of the main cast of the White Base, we do see many arrogant and annoying Federation troops, like those in Amuro's house in Coming Home. Clearly, because Gundam is Japanese as a series, because the Japanese lost World War II, this must be some lingering statement that they were actually the good guys. This is, once again, very politely, extremely stupid and dumb. To counter back on this, let me ask a simple question. What does every Gundam episode end with? It ends with, who will survive? Or, the original Japanese, will you be able to survive? It's easy to assume this means the characters, Amuro specifically, or maybe just, the White Base crew, just something to excite the audience in regards to the setting of war. However, the actual meaning was expressed by Tomino in regards to the sense that humanity was approaching a time of crisis. I think the human race, which has begun to proliferate, has no choice but to head towards self-destruction. It was around the time I launched the Gundam Project that I started thinking about it specifically, and set the theme. Will you be able to survive? I'm not referring to you locally, humanity is what I meant. This is the terrifying story that can't be ignored. So why do I mention this, and how does it relate to these moments of humanity? I think it's really kind of simple. As I've presented over the course of this section, the nuance and historical framework and concept of the One-Year War in regards to Gundam has been showing something obvious. The point of this work is not to present war as a victory of political power and glory. The point of Gundam was, and is, to confront youth with a story of conflict in war, to present that war as a believable and historically based thing, but in doing so, to accomplish something more. Gundam presents war as a time of suffering and loss, a time where selfish political power, motivated by heady ideals and self-interest, will grind down and destroy countless human lives to achieve those goals, where leaders, insulated by their power, can cause this destruction. Thus, the humanization of Zeon and the criticism of the Earth Federation are not absolute statements on who's the good side, who's the bad side. Zeon is most definitely the worst of the two. But the goal is instead to show us that there is no victory in war. There is no gain, only the loss of human life. Because, as Tomino said, it is as humanity, as a whole, that we face the time of crisis, a crisis like war. And when you view humanity as a whole, as approaching this crisis and fighting with itself, then there's no war where any gain is possible, only tragedy and loss. Thus, humanizing Zeon serves this very reason, and the White Base crew fighting to survive is just that, fighting to endure the war adults have caused. Thus, Amuro's fight against Ramba Ral is made all the more tragic. Yes, Ramba Ral is a good man. Haman is a nice lady. Amuro and the other White Base crew, however, will still need to defeat and more than likely kill them to survive and end the war. Thus, there is little emotional catharsis in Amuro defeating Ramba Ral in combat. There's even less in Ral's men getting killed. Ral not getting his Dom mobile suits, even while advantageous for the White Base, means his force will be fighting disadvantaged. Thus, his fanatical final attack and the death of his men, the deaths of those defending White Base crew, his final suicide, Haman's kamikaze charge, and Ryu's sacrifice to stop her, all feel just as they should, as a hollow waste of human life. The White Base, Amuro, Bright, Mirai, Sayla, Kai, Hayato, Frau, all have survived, but none have won anything. There is no bright future. Well, okay, there's Bright and there's Mirai, whose name means future. There's no literal bright future, so long as the war carries on. Now, if all Gundam was a fairly well-rounded and nuanced war story, Gundam would still be pretty friggin' great. But you may have noticed I haven't mentioned something. Despite now basically being over halfway through the series and almost 2 hours into this recording, something big, something 18 meters tall, bright white, red, blue, not the least of which also to mention the animation involved. Also, wasn't it kind of weird that like Amuro and Haman seem to communicate with each other like almost magically? What was that thing? The thing I needed to mention, the big thing. Something important? Maybe even the main title? I wonder what... There are some who dismiss all details beyond the core themes and characters of a work as ancillary, who say that these distinguishing aspects are merely secondary to the plot and persons involved, that all other elements are just additions to the human heart in conflict with itself. I, however, disagree strongly. If you remove the machines, hovercraft, and computers of the Matrix, yeah, you still have a compelling quest for identity against authority, but you don't really have the Matrix. Likewise, if you remove the starfighters, planets, laser swords, spaceships, and droids, Star Wars' core story of adventure and maturity is compelling as just that, but it isn't Star Wars any longer. As core to the identity of Star Trek is the Enterprise, or Defiant, mobile suits are core to the identity of Gundam. After all, it's called Mobile Suit Gundam. It would be absurd to downplay the importance of the mecha to this work. But it also begs a simple but important question. What the hell is a mobile suit? Where does it come from? In order to give you the fourth reason as to why do we still care about Gundam, I'll do exactly that. It begins with the light of Shiva, with the atomic bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. It begins with the invention of the airplane. Since ancient times, armies fought against one another in essence through the battle of momentum. To win, and then to keep winning. To do this, you need ground forces to fight and capture terrain and advance. But the invention of the airplane made some dream. Perhaps, with the ability to fly, momentum-based war would become secondary. You bypass the enemy lines of attack and defense, fly directly over their strategic targets and destroy them. No more complex, long, bloody battles and armies. A direct war. Unfortunately, World War I and then absolutely World War II disproved this. The Allied bombing campaigns were unable to singularly defeat Germany, and Germany's initial attacks on Britain did little but galvanize the British in public support for the war. Thus, in both World War I and World War II, offensive ground-based pushes were needed. A huge invasion was required, and in World War II, D-Day pushed from one side while the Soviets pushed from the other. Air power was vital, and it was powerful, but it couldn't singularly defeat the enemy. It's worth noting as well that even Japan had to be constantly pressured by not just air power, but naval power and the threat of a ground campaign, either from the US or from Russia, to set them up for their surrender. Until the unfortunate fission of fate, the collision of air power and atomic weaponry gave the strong impression otherwise. The nuclear destruction of the two Japanese cities famously created this impression. For the United States, a country whose entry into the war was caused by Japanese carrier aviation, America had hammered its exit with strategic bombing and now with nuclear weapons delivered by air power. U.S. Army Air Force General Doolittle, the same man who had planned the Doolittle Raid, the first American attack on the Japanese home islands after Pearl Harbor, famously said that by the end of the war, the Navy had the transport to make the invasion of Japan possible, the ground forces had the power to make it successful, and the B-29 made it unnecessary. And so there was a lingering appeal in this. In spite of the complex armies and navies, expensive to maintain and to train, the notion that war was now a pure effort of air power and nuclear weapons. Of course, this impression was false, but it is an important starting point. And so, the post-war decades stretched on, and it was clear that even in the age of nuclear power, nuclear air power, war was not over. The Korean War of 1950 to 1953, often overlooked, proved exactly that. Over 1 million soldiers wounded, and at least 500,000 dead. From South Korea holding on to a scant divot of the peninsula, to surging back with American support, before China entered after the US forces under General MacArthur crossed the 38th parallel, and with North Koreans pushed back. MacArthur wanted to use nuclear power. President Truman did not. Thus the war ended with an armistice. But it had been right on the bleeding edge. The US had almost created the first atomic ground war, but only almost. As the war ended in 1953, the US had to consider this possibility. What would fighting on a nuclear battlefield look like? What would it entail? In 1955, under Dwight D. Eisenhower, Chief of Staff of the Army, Maxwell D. Taylor, would introduce a new concept: the Pentomic Army. Penta, for the 5 parts, and atomic, for designed to fight in a nuclear battlefield. A new formation that set it apart from the earlier World War II and post-war unit organizations. I know this chart looks like some indecipherable military jargon, but what you are looking at is the last common ancestor of ground forces and what will become the mobile suit. The DNA that would lead to the evolution to the machine called Gundam. I won't bore you here with the exact details of the pentomic structure, but I will emphasize what it entailed. In essence, the Pentomic Army was distinguished by one underlying assumption: any significant concentration of forces on the battlefield would be targeted by tactical, or strategic, nuclear weapons. So with an emphasis on 3 main factors which would be inherited by its descendants: long-reaching communications, able to coordinate units, hard-hitting, long-range firepower to overcome the distributed nature, and an extreme emphasis on mobility. In order to survive on a battlefield with nukes, you hit hard, you shoot far, you talk well, and you move fast. Why, with Davy Crockett, we don't even need to rely on air-delivered nuclear charges. Even infantry, even better, artillery, can rapidly deploy nuclear munitions in support. The Pentomic structure would last from 1955 to 1963, but it had great flaws. It was hard to coordinate so many units, hard to mobilize them towards the right target when so spread out, hard to coordinate fire from rifles and machine guns at what are essentially almost maximum ranges, all just to avoid losing the entire unit in a nuclear attack. These would be the flaws that undid the Pentomic Army. However, amidst this period, in 1959, awash in this nuclear battlefield thinking, a certain writer wrote a book. A book of interesting, if questionable, political views. But more importantly, a book that proposed an even more ambitious concept. What if, for communications, every soldier had a full radio set built into their equipment? What if, for long-range firepower, even the individual infantryman could be armed with machine guns and flamethrowers and grenades, but also nuclear weapons? And what if, instead of an armored personnel carrier, each infantryman wore a suit of CBRN armor, with a nuclear power generator and jetpack to match, able to bounce aggressively forward, and then surpass the mobility of the APC? I think you know by now exactly where I'm going. As translated into Japanese, the Universal Warrior, the Galactic Fighter, the Starship Trooper. This, in a nutshell, is the basis of the origin of the mobile suit. This lineage of mixed DNA, of nuclear weapons, high protection, and mobile infantry, of what we now call, because of that book, powered armor. At this point, we can now return to Japan and anime to see how this creates the mobile suit. In 1975, the Japanese science fiction magazine named SF Magazine, Kazutaka Miyatake and Naoyuki Kato from Studio Nue, the same which would later make Macross, produced a series of illustrations. These designs would later be reused for the 1988 OVA Starship Troopers. However, well before that, and relevant to us, Miyatake's designs would be filtered into Gundam far more directly. As far as I've been able to research as well, Yoshiyuki Tomino was already a huge nerd who read a lot of science fiction. It seems likely that another Studio Nue member, the only to actually work directly on Gundam, Kenichi Matsuzaki, likely pushed Starship Troopers to Tomino. Alternatively, many members of the production were encouraged to read it by Haruka Takachiho, the creator of Crusher Joe and Dirty Pair. So these two present the best link. What is also funny is that Tomino, in at least one interview from 1988, said, "First of all, I would like to say that the story and concept of Gundam's mobile suit came from Starship Troopers is a lie. I disliked Heinlein's colonial tastes and was only taught how to use English to apply the word suit to a machine." I think, honestly, knowing Tomino's personality, having Gundam, this vehemently anti-war work, be associated with Starship Troopers, a politically pretty pro-military work, likely irked him a lot. I think pretty unquestionably he had his own ideas about mecha, but it's also hard to debate the influence Starship Troopers had on Gundam. So while Gundam would not inherit even an ounce of Starship Troopers politics at all, its mobile suits would inherit its powered armor. As evidence of that, the character artist Yasuhiko would get Kunio Okawara to do mechanical design for Gundam, based on his work for Daitarn 3. I have a whole video about Kunio Okawara here if you want to get a little more. But relevant to us now, Okawara said, "Studio Nue's initial design influence came in the form of the gun cannon, and this was done by Kazutaka Miyatake, who had recently worked on the illustrations for the Starship Troopers novel. However, Yasuhiko brought me in around this time, as this early gun cannon design wasn't strong enough to lead the whole project. So, not protagonist material, and I proposed the Gundam instead. In the process of coming up with the Gundam, there were ideas from a great many people reflected in the final design, so it's not like a single-handed thing. To clarify, the version of the gun cannon now known in Mobile Suit Gundam is very different from the one that was originally designed. It changed quite dramatically from the original design and idea. It was maybe more like the powered suit Miyatake did for Starship Troopers. So there's a lot of irony here, as the later Starship Troopers OVA, that would be greenlit and released in 1988, would be made because of the success of Gundam. Yet its designs were directly what helped Gundam's concept of mobile suits get made in the first place in 1979. So despite their rainbow colors and giant size, the mobile suits in Gundam do have a pretty concrete, traceable origin in previous science fiction and military history. Now, having said that, I do feel the need to balance that a bit. Because despite having just spent now most of this section relating the military and science fiction origins of the grounded half of Gundam, it's also impossible to ignore just how much at the same time it retains an 18-meter, rainbow-colored toy half as well. This is yet another, and perhaps one of the first big issues I took with the attempt to concretely codify shows as real robot or super robot, and Gundam in particular using those terms. Okawara himself mentions, The reason why Yasuhiko chose me was because Studio Nui were a group of people that got together to work around a science fiction theme. In that sense, all the points of the view they brought were really science fiction centric, not exactly a wide-ranging type of entertainment. So they wanted to make the whole thing really scientific, and their mecha weren't all that inclusive. Whereas Tatsunoko Productions could work on a wider range of themes, and it could include mecha designs that wasn't specifically science fiction centric. So one of the big reasons Okawara was brought on was specifically to make a more fun, broadly appealing set of designs that were very much not just to appeal to a hardcore SF fan. As he expands from the same interview, he sums it up pretty well. So what I proposed for the Gundam was basically a samurai. So the head had a chonmage at the top, with a face, and a maedate in the form of a V-fin. It was also meant to be 18 meters tall. The next project coming up was something based in outer space, using mecha, as well as something that had never been done before. This was the whole idea. The inspiration then was to come from the clothes or suit an astronaut wears. That's where the idea for mobile suits came from. I proposed this, literally taking the ideas from the astronaut's clothing and then made into a mecha. As a toy though, this doesn't sell. At the time, Sunrise and I had gone to Clover, a toy company, to deliver the presentation. The selling point being that this wasn't a fighting mecha, but that it was a merchandisable A and B parts, with the core fighter in the middle, thus allowing kids to play with a variety of parts. I was mainly working on the ideas for the toys because it has to sell that in terms of the merchandising. So, much like Tomino's polar drives to both make serious fiction but balance it with a wider mass appeal, the mechanical design of Gundam faced identical pressure as well. The SF fans in the industry wanted to push anime towards serious SF. The sponsors and the toy companies wanted to push it towards toys and sales. This, in a nutshell, underlines my searing hatred of trying to box Gundam in with real and super as hard definitions. Super serious fans will downplay the toy-like attributes and focus on the war and drama. The super robo fans will try to focus on the rainbow fun, the beams, and downplay the serious war. But which is it, Argenbolt? Is Gundam and its mobile suits a serious nuclear hellscape powered by fighting machine vehicles to carry drama? Or is it a goddamn plastic metal toy for kids to slam together and combine and deep fry? Well, it's both. Duh. That's it. That is literally it. Gundam is, in a word, a lungfish. So yes, the Dom is 18 meters tall and bright black and purple with a heat blade, but it's also a nuclear-powered open-cycle thermal hover vehicle and military combat suit. Gundam is a drama about the human suffering of war in the middle of a science fiction near future that reflects our world, but it isn't as grounded or as realistic as the way more niche later SF mecha works. Gundam never gave up what started with this series. Large, flamboyant, titanic, toy-like machines. In fact, I would go so far as to argue that as I have laid out, that tension between adulthood and childhood, between consumerism and serious fiction, between the drama and tragedy of war and the absurd neon machines that fight it, that, right there, is the tension and appeal of Gundam in a big way. Nothing really sums this up better than the first two mobile suits we see in action, the Zaku and the Gundam. Eiji Yamura, head of Sunrise Planning, and as I've mentioned before, one of the folks who helped get Gundam made, kinda best summed this up in an interview from 2003. The important thing is the Gundam, and the reason why I got it right is that Zaku is a weapon, but Gundam is a character. It's a complete character. However, everyone misunderstands that Zaku came with weapons theory, so robots are weapons. I don't think that other people are fully aware that Gundam is a character. It's a complete character. That's the end of the giant robo thing. In short, he's a character with a very human sense who looks cool. Fundamentally, no later Gundam series ever fully gave this up. Gundam would occasionally skew younger and occasionally skew older in its presentation and themes, but like a true lungfish, it never committed either way. So once again, real robot and super robot, outside of casual qualifiers and a thing invented by toy companies, fucking suck at describing the very works they are used to build their own definitions. And perhaps, one final funny thing before we move on, is that both Haruka Takachiho and prolific SF author Ryo Mitsue ultimately disliked Gundam a lot, almost exactly because of this. It's just one of those 79-80 shows. It's so shallow. Never make a part 2. I expect nothing from anime. Takachiho, 1. Fake mechanics. 2. Unscientific depiction. 3. Unnecessary war. Mitsuse. Funnily enough, Tomino even sort of agreed. It is hilarious that Gundam, a mecha work which would define Japanese SF, was panned by some hardcore fans, including one of the ones who helped inspire it, for not being realistic enough. Damn jeez. Well, shucks, Gundam, you're not a real robot show. In fact, you're not even the first. Oh, here you go, Dougram. You can have this. So now, we know pretty well where the mobile suit concept came from, its origin in very real world and military concepts, and how those transformed over the creation of Gundam with the addition of consumerist toy design. But that leaves a more direct question. Now that we know what and where the mobile suit is and where it comes from in 0079, why and how did it leave such a lasting impact on this first series? To answer this question, I think we can move through the middle core and arc of Gundam. Amuro and the ARC-78's battle against the Black Tri-Stars as a perfect example in motion to show how. The Trap of M'Quve starts off with a thrilling little sequence of combat. The Goof, once a weapon that Ramba Ral used to fight Amuro to a standstill, is now something that Amuro takes down just like the countless Zaku before it. Indeed, by the end of this episode, the Gundam is chewing through Goofs. Already, an obvious reason for the mobile suit's appeal is apparent. Amuro's growth as a character and mastering the Gundam is paralleled in his fighting proficiency. From a nervous boy haphazardly reading the manual in the cockpit, to someone now capable of fighting his way through. As well, the subtle but obvious advantage of treating mecha as a mass-production machine of war has its benefits. Even if the individual battles against the Zaku and Goof get easier for Amuro as a pilot, their threat as a machine essentially remains fixed. Zeon can always build more, and only one needs to get a good lucky shot to kill him. By the end of the episode, in retaliation for destroying multiple mining bases, M'Quve has wounded the white base to the point it must land and repair. It's also over this period that we see the equally absurd and often forgotten land battleships of the Federation and Zeon. Mechanically, they're really fun, and they are, battleships, but on land. Matilda makes her return with the resupply craft bringing desperately needed supplies to White Base, after M'Quve's attack, but is ambushed en route. Let's show some footage of Amuro and Kai going to help her out. Now is a fun time to mention beam weapons. Interestingly, from the 1978 series setting notes, laser cannons aren't used in the story, since the light beams of lasers aren't visible in a vacuum. Beam weapons are used instead, because the system that uses magnetism to fire charged particles can draw on the power of the nuclear fusion engine. These systems are installed on spaceships and fighting craft as main and secondary cannons. The installation of charged particle beam cannons has been standard, partly because it results in a lower weight and easier maintenance than loading large quantities of warheads. Incidentally, the beams from charged particle cannons can be seen even in a vacuum. It is fascinating that this would go on to be the iconic trait of mobile suits. Bright energy beams, energy swords, pink explosions. They were not rooted in simple SF trope of energy weaponry. Instead, like the mobile suits, which wield them, they originate from Gundam's commitment to its technical relative realism and deliverable believability to its audience again. It is true, lasers in space leave no visible beam, so the choice of bright, magnetically contained energy to make combat readable by the audience and visceral in its destruction is a smart one. This ties into something larger, but before I get to that, let's continue. The G-Fighter shows up, and Matilda's supply units manage to make it to White Base. This takes us to a dramatic episode perfect for this section's subject matter, the Black Tri-Stars. Of course, I need to mention the great character moment of the impressionable White Base enlisted boys taking a photo with Matilda. It's a little awkward, it's a little too earnest, but then again, so is much of the experience of adolescence. Of course, it's setting up the tragedy to come. Returning to the subject, it is fantastic how much the Black Tri-Stars add. For baddies that show up and are first defeated in one episode, it's impressive exactly how much this accomplishes. Firstly, as with Char and Ramba Ral, the Tri-Stars reinforce the marriage of mecha to the concept of an ace. After all, if mobile suits are mass-produced, weapons of war, it really wouldn't be odd that as with fighter planes, certain pilots would be exceptionally gifted. Especially when, in World War I and World War II, mass-produced fighter and bomber aircraft were made well before the full science of flight was understood. The mobile suit in the One-Year War here parallels the process of Zeon and the Earth scrambling to develop and employ new weapons. Like the impact of motor torpedo boats on battleships, fighter planes and carriers on ground warfare, and also battleships, the mobile suit in this war is a game-changing landmark moment. The mobility of the Dom is also shown to be extreme, with its ability to go on a powered skate and hover and move at great speed. You can see that original concept of Starship Troopers mobile infantry come through. Another interesting quote to mention here is the inclusion of the Minovsky particle. This invention of a kind of prolific radiation spread by mobile suit reactors, and fusion reactors in general in Gundam, was something I found later often attributed to a stark scientific idea, as an excuse to downplay guided missiles and sensors. The reality is far more cinematic. From the Tomino interview, to create cinema, you have to rely on the structure of each scene. Normally, within each shot, you tend to need 2 points, allies and enemies, to focus on to make it work. However, if you're going to make a story based around war in space, how can you frame a scene like that? The distances are so vast. To solve this problem, my team and I came up with the idea of the Minovsky particle. When this was distributed across large areas, you couldn't rely on radar or detect where the enemy might be. This meant that forces had to be closer to one another in order to fight. If I hadn't been conscious of theatrical expression, the Mobile Suit Gundam would be the same as any other type of story about war. The Minovsky particle then forced the characters to meet one another, either in joy or in vengeance. It created a sense of tension and established a dramatic atmosphere. I know this episode's battle takes place on Earth, but I do bring this up for good reason. In trying to explain how and why mobile suits resonated so well, I think it's fundamental to understand this machine is intrinsically linked to the struggle of the characters who pilot them. Look no further than this very fight. It took Amuro well over 10 episodes to get a mastery on fighting Zaku's and Char. He then struggled at length to beat Rambaral's one goof. Now, in the span of a single episode, Amuro fights and is able to defeat Zeon's essentially brand new mobile suit. His fighting ability is no longer being carried by the Gundam's technological overmatch. It is clear Amuro has grown as a pilot in skill and power, and more importantly has grown as a character as well. Sadly, even with his skills, Matilda's brutal death at the hands of the Black Tri-Stars scars and wounds the White Base crew. Even Frau, who is jealous of Amuro's affection for Matilda. Destroying the Black Tri-Stars no more heals the wound than Rio's death against Rambaral and Haman. Thus we can close out this section on what the previous have been building up to, the Battle of Odessa, and the fourth reason why we still care. The battle rages fiercely as the forces of the Earth Federation Supreme Commander Revel battles with Makuvi. The White Base is attacked by the remaining Black Tri-Stars. In an interesting mirror to how we began this section, Makuvi is not entirely unlike MacArthur in the Korean War, willing to break the Antarctic Treaty and use hydrogen fusion nuclear bombs to hold off Revel's forces. In the end, Revel's forces advance and Makuvi launches the fusion warhead missile. The Gundam fights off and kills the last Black Tri-Stars before disarming the missile by way of beam saber. Revel, the Federation, and the White Base have won the Battle of Odessa. Zeon's resource operation in Central Asia has been destroyed. Admittedly, there are times where I find the fact that Zeon was dependent on resources from Earth odd. It makes historical analog quite well, with Zeon being paralleled here by Nazi Germany, but Zeon and the space colonies in general must have used vast quantities of resources mined from the moon and the asteroids like Luna 2 to build their colonies. But thinking to the events of this episode, I'm reminded of one line that made me roar with laughter when I read it in the series setting notes. Hopefully you will soon see why. The reason why the Principality of Zeon went to war with the Federation was development of the mobile suit. Battles aren't decided only by combat between spaceships, and victory or defeat are determined, just as in ancient times, starting with the capture of enemy territory by infantry. The development of armored-powered spacesuits, mobile suits, thus gave Zeon confidence that it could surpass the Federation. The Federation has developed new mobile suits of its own based on the combat experience of the 3-day battle and the Battle of Loom. Reference to Zeon mobile suits and the results of previous research. The development code was VX78. 3 types were developed, and the story begins as they are completed. That one line, the capture of enemy territory by infantry, it shot through all my points here like a perfect pink beam cannon. It is true. Fundamentally true. Just as true now as it was in 1979, as it was in 1945. After years of personal study in military history, it is basically a steel-clad bedrock. Not the invention of the airplane, nor the invention of atomic weapons, not the creation of precision-guided munitions with computer technology, not stealth materials, not even drones, has fundamentally changed the fact that in war, infantry must take and hold ground to assure victory. it is happening right now in Ukraine. The drones did not help the US win Afghanistan. The stealth bomber on its own did not win in the attempted pure air war campaign in the Balkans during the Yugoslav War. The single largest post-World War II and Vietnam air campaign in Desert Storm explicitly only worked because of the massive Allied ground campaign as well. Zeon started the war with mobile suits. Descending to Earth to fight the Federation is an echo of this, holding ground. Amuro's fighting in his Gundam, Tomino and the other staff who helped make Gundam, and focusing the story on this strange, massive, human-shaped fighting machine, and having them fight not just in space, but on Earth, echo this fundamental truth. The idea that these machines disqualify themselves from a story of war is in essence absurd. The idea you could tell Gundam without them is likewise. Here, I am reminded of the classic William Faulkner banquet speech from 1950. 30 years before Gundam, written in the shadow of the atomic era. Our tragedy today is a general universal physical fear, so long sustained by now that we can even bear it. There are no longer problems of the spirit. There is only the question, when will I be blown up? Because of this, the young man or woman writing today has forgotten the problems of the human heart in conflict with itself, which alone can make good writing, because only that is worth writing about, worth the agony and the sweat. The human heart fundamentally resides in the human form. The human form, combined with the atomic technology of the nuclear era, is the Starship Trooper, the mobile suit. Thus, Yoshiyuki Tomino achieved both his literary fiction, his drama, and his mass-market appeal. Tomino, in a genius move, found a way to make a machine whose stories were always the human heart in conflict with itself, while also being able to spectacularly be blown up. War is the battle of humanity with itself. Infantry are the purest form of the humanity in war. The mobile suit is the marriage of all the technology in and after World War II back into the purest form of war. The fundamentally stupid idea that mobile suits, or even mecha, are somehow not tied to characters, and that characters exist in spite of these machines, is so exceptionally wrong, for no vehicle beyond mecha can truly and so fully encompass the physical sensation of our human body in combat with other humans, with the power of machines. More than any Enterprise, more than any X-Wing. And so here, at last, is the fourth reason why we still care about Gundam. 4. Gundam's mobile suits, founded in then futuristic but developing military ideas, took Starship Troopers' ideas of powered armor and used it as a base to create a relative technical realism focused on making a future war intimate, personal, and tense. It balanced this against a toy-based consumer appeal built on the merchandising trends of the 1970s. In the humanoid form of the mobile suit, the individual character and their struggle brought the appeal of previous mecha shows to a new level. Amidst the drama and tragedy of war, in spite of their scale and toyetic design, or perhaps exactly because of it, mobile suits endure as perhaps the most human SF vehicle for conflict. Of course, all of this had to use something to achieve this. It had to use the medium of animation, its limitations and its possibilities. And so with that, we move on. I do think it is an obvious thing to overlook just how much anime as a medium played into Gundam, and in turn, how much within Gundam narratively was shaped by just that fact. As a perfect example, we now arrive at episode 26, Char Returns. What amazing coordination, Argenbolt. Why, thank you, Argenbolt. No, thank you, Argenbolt. Because yeah, have you ever thought about that? Char, arguably one of the most influential anime characters of all time, indisputably a core component of Gundam's personality and success, an antagonist as famous as Darth Vader, with 1,000,000 times more character depth, you know it's true, straight up isn't an entire third of the original Gundam. From episode 10 being the last time Char does something big in the plot, to episode 12, where Dozle demotes him and he's drinking his sorrows away in a bar, Char is just absent from the plot for the following 14 episodes, besides an occasional mention. Despite how defining and impactful he is, this does bring up a simple question. Why the hell is Char so absent from the entire middle third of Gundam? Now of course you could say, oh well, you know, Char was demoted for getting Garma killed. but even with that in-universe explanation, it still feels off. There's really no wonder decades later that Yasuhiko's retake of his series felt compelled to fill in this gap with the flashback chapters, looking at Char and Sayla's backstory. But here in the original series, what caused this? The consensus in Japanese Gundam historians lays the blame firmly once again on Clover, Gundam's toy company. Yes, the same toy company who were more than likely behind Gundam's early cancellation. Both Kenji Inomata in his 1995 book, Gundam Myth, and, this is a wordful, Nikkei Business Publications Technology Research Department's 1999 analysis paper, Anime Business Changes, The Truth of Anime and Character Business, point to Clover's direct meddling as the reason for Char's withdrawal from Gundam's middle chapters. The sponsor feeling that Char's serious character was, the gloomy character Char is bad. It was only after fans mailed in and asked questions like, where's Char, that they reconsidered. According to, once again, Wataru Sekioka, there was even a plan to kill Char off, but he convinced the studio to abandon this after the fan backlash and demands for him to reappear. So you can see just how much impact Clover had as a primary sponsor. The shape of the One-Year War and major characters appearing in it were at the mercy of them. Try to imagine a world where Char dies mid-0079. Zeta, Char's counterattack all get completely warped beyond recognition or just don't happen. When you end up making a foundational work like Gundam, these tiny changes early on ripple outwards massively. While I am mentioning Clover and the animation, I do want to quickly dip back to Doan's Island for a moment. Certain Gundam YouTube videos make pretty wild claims that Clover sent over an episode director who interfered with Tomino's vision, spinning a narrative that this was the reason behind Tomino's disdain for that episode. This, put politely, is total bullshit. Looking into it with Kanon, this just doesn't add up. The episode director and storyboard guy working with Tomino in this episode was Shinya Sadamitsu, who definitely not sent by Clover for this episode. Sadamitsu would work on 13 episodes of Gundam with Tomino, and worked with Tomino both before and after Gundam on other anime. So if that isn't it, why did Tomino not like this episode? I thought we already went over Doan's Island, Argenbolt, why bring it up again? Well, because it illustrates another point instead, very well, relating to this section, namely that Gundam was not something exclusively worked on by Studio Sunrise. In addition, Studio Z, Nakamura Productions, and Artland would contribute the main chunks of animation. Additionally, most of the series cell painting would be handled by Studio Dean. So if you ever see those bad off-model images of Gundam that get passed around and some moron goes, "Whoa, look how bad it is," with total sincerity, remind him that Gundam was made in coordination between like 100 different people and like 5 different studios, at a time when the art of animation was still very much being worked out and experimented with. For example, Studio Z, who would help animate episodes 4, 11, 20, 25, 32, and 38, were basically a bunch of dudes crammed into a single-floor apartment. Several of their episodes required a good number of Yasuhiko's editing and corrections for being so off-model, or just to improve them. Doan's Island in particular is a great example of this, being outsourced to Studio Anime Friend, who as far as I can tell only worked on this episode. Who the hell is Studio Anime Friend? They were a sub-studio owned by Tatsunoko Productions, but who were themselves just a middle company for coordinating with, yes, another layer of subcontracted Korean animation studios. So yeah, a subcontracted Korean studio, or studios, working for a subcontracted studio itself belonging to the subcontracted studio group working for Sunrise. Boy, I do wonder how the animation of a show could suffer from this. It's not like animation is a work which gains a lot of consistency from repeated practice, you know, to keep complex machines and characters and spaceships on model or anything. So, Argenbolt, why did Tomino dislike Doan's Island? Well, knowing what I just told you, and knowing what I told you before about Tomino's life, I'm proposing a new, but far less flashy theory. Tomino, a director who learned directing under the limited animation style of Mushi Productions, is working on the major series, Mobile Suit Gundam. After having directed multiple modern, for the time, anime, he wants to tell a big cool sci-fi story with some larger ideas, but he also wants to make a successful commercial product as well. Under neither of these cases is subpar work, the product of triple-layer outsourcing animation to secondary studios, basically tertiary studios, really desirable. Doan's Island as a standalone story, meant to beef up the episode number, also meant, while thematically fitting, it was never a key episode per se. So Tomino just wasn't satisfied with the level of work put into that episode, one that isn't a major overarching plot chapter. That's it. Mystery solved. Another mystery I thought to unwind was exactly why Western fans used Doan's Island and the Salt episode so singularly as excuses to just skip to the movies. The answer to that one is actually much simpler. The Gundam movies were available dubbed much earlier than 0079, and Western fans who were introduced to Gundam via Wing and G Gundam weren't ever really huge fans of the older animations to begin with. This kind of set a bad precedent and kind of locked in a bias that was carried over to younger generations, even while being kind of fundamentally stupid. So it's pretty easy to say, wow, compared to modern anime, look how bad Gundam can be. But this is a pretty poorly educated take. What Gundam really is a, wow, considering how many moving parts of variable quality, it is amazing just what they achieved in spite of their limitations. In particular, character designer Yasuhiko would work on storyboards and fixing as many of the off-model stuff as possible, doing so until he basically collapsed from overwork while trying to fix episode 34 around fall 1979. In fact, I can't think of a better time to bring up Yoshikazu Yasuhiko, and his massive impact on Gundam in relation to that. Yasuhiko was born to relative poverty in Hokkaido. Growing up, he took an interest in manga in particular and learned to draw. He specifically mentioned Yokoyama's Oda Nobunaga series as a big inspiration. Yasuhiko's background and the larger context of the war in Vietnam meant he was a member of the Japanese student New Left movement. This would end up with him getting expelled from Hirosaki University for his involvement in those movements from 1969, and ironically put him on a collision course to a career as character designer. Coincidentally, much like Yoshiyuki Tomino, he would see an ad to work at Mushi Productions in the paper. While not initially interested in animation in particular, he would work there until the company's bankruptcy in the early 1970s. It was around that time that he would work on a certain famous Warcraft of Cosmic Izumo show. Here, Yoshinobu Nishizaki, Yamato's co-creator and producer, would push Yasuhiko to do storyboards because of his talent. I had the impression that he was scary, but when we actually started working together, I found that most of the storyboards I drew were almost perfect the first time. He would say, "I don't like this part," or "this scene should be longer." I would check the storyboard myself, so I didn't remember him getting angry. The first storyboard I drew was for episode 6. He praised the beginning of the scene, saying, "I like the way you're going in." He liked me for some reason, and I did about 10 storyboards out of the 26 episodes. If you consider that much participation, I did about half the work. Interestingly, Nishizaki would also produce Triton of the Sea, which was Tomino's directorial debut, as Nishizaki had previously worked at Mushi Productions, senior to both Tomino and Yasuhiko. It was, in no small part, the success of Yamato that helped propel Yasuhiko's career. He would continue to work on Yamato's works across the 1970s, while, at the same time, working on other stuff like Gundam. And yes, this is partially why he collapsed midway through Gundam, as he was simultaneously working on Yamato's sequel projects during Gundam's production. It was on those works, much like Tomino, that Yasuhiko would then hone his character design and storyboard and episode directing skills, Combattler V, and then in relation to Tomino, writing and Zambot 3 in particular. Once again, the iterative nature of the rapid-fire mecha shows honed his craft. This naturally led to Gundam's designs for both Amuro and Char, as he says. Gundam was a project where the character designs were settled upon easily. A big-eyed boy with curly hair who wasn't cheerful or frankly especially handsome. In other words, an anime hero quite unlike those who came before him. When Tomino, the director, approached me with this concept for the lead, I'd already been envisioning just such a character. It was as if we had read each other's minds, and Amuro's design was quickly finalized. Since Amuro wasn't going to be handsome, we decided to make his adversary, Char Aznable, good-looking instead. This move was inspired by the character Shakin from Writing, a show Tomino and I had worked on together previously. He had been well received by female fans, and through him, I learned villains were also capable of leaving a strong impression. But since handsome characters aren't interesting enough on their own, Char needed an individual element to distinguish him, thus the mask to conceal his face. This had the added effect of giving him an air of mystery. Call it haphazard or superficial of me. So once again, even in the character design, the preceding mecha works acted as a bedrock Gundam could build off of, with characters like Shakin leading to Char, which phonetically is totally just coincidence, I'm sure, or choose to subvert that with Amuro being a departure from others like Banjo Haran. Interestingly though, Yasuhiko has even more to say, which only reinforces my point here, while also talking about the ethnicity of the characters. As for Bright Noah, he's 19, but mentally much older. Role-wise, he's the middle management type. So I gave him his hairstyle, imagining he'd develop a receding hairline a few years down the line. The biggest factor behind us being able to design the cast so freely was the TV programming agency becoming lax with their inspections. Normally, they'd go over characters and make demands like, the hero must be Japanese, he must be handsome and cheerful. But with Gundam, they let everything pass without comment. I had even thought up a backup setting for Amuro, which changed the Rei in his name to Rei, and listed his birthplace as being the mountains of Shimane, but we didn't end up needing it. While we're on the topic, the character of Mirai Yashima and Hayata Kobayashi sprang from this hidden agenda of wanting to portray the Japanese in supporting instead of starring roles for a change. That's also why I made them shorter and plumper with smaller eyes. I think it does say a lot about why Gundam worked. Like the Universal Century being a floating point in chronology for the story, the creative decision and creative freedom of Yasuhiko's designs was both derived from the pedigree of earlier works, while also being more ethnically open. Now I choose to see Amuro Rei as Canadian, because he is, but the white base crew could be read and understood by really any Western audience because of this. This isn't to say the white base crew is the most diverse cast ever, but rather them being not explicitly Japanese leaves their cultural appeal open. And as mentioned before, as we all live now in a neoliberal, not end of history geopolitical period, in a way, we in the West are all stuck on the white base, metaphorically. Speaking of which, now that I've gone over Yasuhiko's contributions, let's get back to the white base, where we, right. Char Returns has a great looking missile launch from the submarine that is fantastically done for the time. A backflip from the Gundam capturing and maintaining its mechanical details through the dynamism of the shot. We also have some detailed water splash effects to boot. Also relevant is the shot of the GOG crushing the anti-aircraft battery. Remember this for later, this is important. On that note, I do really need to mention a bunch of amphibious mobile suits and submarines that launched them in this episode. Now I have talked a bunch about submarines before, but it is notable that in addition to the aircraft carrier and planes, submarines would end up being the other big success of World War II. Both planes and submarines are three-dimensional combatants, which redefined war. The addition of nuclear power in particular supercharged the submarine to new heights. Here Gundam is once again fusing past and future. The next episode, Female Spy on Board, continues this. Giving Zeon submarine forces as their main naval power obviously reminds us of Germany's heavy use of them in World War II. The design of them is reminiscent of an almost fusion of the Japanese I-400 carrier submarines, as well as more advanced later nuclear designs. Here, in relation, is a fascinating little bit of technical realism to note when it comes to amphibious mobile suits. Up until now, a defining difference between the Federation and Zeon's mobile suits has been their use of beam weaponry, versus the Zeon's bullets, missiles, and Heat Hawk axes. Only now do we get our first beam weapon equipped mobile suit of Zeon in the GOG. Now the GOG is ugly, but this is actually very clever. Submarines make use of seawater to cool their nuclear reactors while at sea. Here the GOG, and later Akai and Zagok, three, once again amphibious suits, get beam weapons first. They get them because their aquatic nature lets them use the same seawater to cool and maintain their new suit weapons. It's a small bit of technical relative realism, but I appreciate it a lot. In terms of mechanical design, the amphibious suits present also show some fascinating influences. In stark contrast to the gas-masked Zaku or the samurai spacesuit armor of the Gundam, their influences draw heavily on crustaceans and diving suits. Also interestingly, early spacesuit design, another thing foundational to Gundam's mechanical design, also used a lot of this similar language. Because before people really knew what space was like, they had to use naval analogies to visualize it. Speaking of, this aquatic arc also presents an interesting parallel in its battles as well. The Gundam being engaged by aquatic mobile suits in the sea being very similar to Gundam's battles in the oceans of space. The Grublo being paralleled by the later Bigro. The sense of a 3D battlefield. Of course, this isn't to downplay the emotional core of this mini-arc, which is the female spy Miharu, having turned traitor against the Federation to support her orphaned siblings. Kai's short attempt at leaving the White Base, much like Amuro before him, is Kai having just had too much of war. He's essentially forced into. There's some great shots of Kai being lit by the battle over Dublin Harbor, and then Across the Atlantic continues these themes. We get Zeon nuclear submarines fighting Federation carriers, and now the added tension of Kai discovering Miharu has snuck on board. Once again, Gundam presents a very sympathetic and human antagonist. Not to say that Zeon is good, or spying is cool, but to set up the ultimate tragedy ahead. Interestingly, the morphology of Gundam also includes our first mobile armor in Across the Atlantic as well. It's kind of obvious, but worth pointing out that all of Zeon's mobile armors trend well away from humanoid designs. They are monstrous and biological. Huge claws, astounding speed, and powerful beams and missile weaponry. Here, Gundam is using a simple anthropomorphic principle of the RX-78 as our humanoid protagonist to do battle with these monsters. Our nuclear-powered, lunar titanium armored Odysseus, Gilgamesh, or Beowulf, fighting and slaying the mobile armor's monstrous sea creature, giant bird, and Cyclops. In the end, Amuro defeats the Grublo, and Miharu is killed in battle. The White Base has survived another battle, but there is once again little room for any feeling of triumph, which leads us to the first half of our very climactic battle for Jaburo. From here onward, the series picks up a lot of pace. The White Base docks in the massive underground fortress capital of the Earth Federation, located in South America. The characters get a moment of relief, and Kai is alone with his sorrow. Once again, the design of Jaburo is fantastic. Space wars are devastating. They are wars where the enemy could drop asteroids or nukes and fire beams and missiles from orbit at you. So digging to put yourself underground, and putting your important stuff there, below hundreds of meters of rock, is a very solid strategy. While its location was, as I mentioned before, probably inspired by the real-life Brasilia city, its design may have been inspired by the actual military sites like the Cheyenne Mountain Complex, which began construction in 1961, and was completed in 1967. However, I can't find any official source verifying this, so it's just my best guess. Amuro has a pretty weighty conversation with Woody in this episode, the betrothed of the recently killed Matilda. It's a simple enough scene, really. Amuro feels guilty over his failure as a pilot and not preventing her death. Woody, instead, harshly reminds Amuro that the war is much bigger than just him and Gundam. He can't act as if all victories and defeats are solely his. Soon enough, though, Char and the Zeon forces launch a massive attack. We also see the first GMs, the mass-produced Federation mobile suit based on the Gundam. Even after the huge Battle of Odessa, the Battle of Jaburo ramps up the scale a lot. Oh yeah, also the GM, being a Mook suit, gets absolutely pasted by Char. The battle of this episode ends climactically. Amuro and Char face off, and after so many episodes of waiting, their brief battle is tense and exciting. Captain Woody tragically dies, and Amuro returns the favor by barely being phased by a Dazak, taking it out in one go. However, Char slips away, and once more the White Base crew is left to solemnly lick their wounds and contemplate their losses. Wow, Argenbolt, that's some cool stuff and all, but isn't this section about animation? I really thought you would mention more shh. Wait, how rude. What about the anime? Wait for it, it's almost. What are you talking about? It's just the credits. For God's sake, we've seen it play every episode. Why bother? Shh. There it is. Main computer, freeze video. Enhance video grid square, G7 through G10. What is it, Argenbolt? A name? Not just any name. For the first time appearing in the credits as a key animator, after doing in-between work on episodes 5 and 12. The man who loves motorcycles, who would found the Missile Circus. Main computer, auto-translate. So yes, as you are now aware, once again, my Zettai Kanpeki timing lined up Ichiro Itano's first on-screen credited work with this section. This was also the reason I wanted to focus on this episode's battle in particular, as it's likely Itano's handiwork went into some of what I just mentioned. Itano would do work on 12 episodes of Gundam as far as I could find, starting as an in-betweener, then graduating with his talents to a key animator to this episode in particular. It is impressive and shows even early on his work really paying off. It basically sets up his bigger involvement and impact in the Gundam movies and subsequent mecha works like Ideon. I would also like to note here a very big disclaimer and warning that, as usual, be wary of English Wikipedia when it comes to anime. It doesn't even list the Gundam TV series on his page. Typical shit Wikipedia anime pages, right? Well, actually, Anime News Network, which, it's in the name, also incorrectly lists his episodes worked on. No surprise there either, and is also regularly garbage. The friggin' Gundam Wiki doesn't even have a page on him. Now that is pathetic. Even websites supposedly dedicated to gathering knowledge, even anime knowledge, even anime Gundam knowledge, largely can't be asked to put the effort in. Itano would also animate the famous battle between the Elmith and the Gundam, in specific the rapid movement of the bit weapons and the Gundam attacks. The animation director thought it was too fast for the audience to read properly, but he left the building, and then Itano did it anyways. I love this pained expression on Itano's face when he talks about it in the extended Gundam documentary. Tomino ended up really liking how the sequence turned out. Of course, it isn't to say that the other animators and artists who worked on Gundam didn't matter, but Itano did contribute a lot of memorable scenes that make Gundam Gundam, such as next episode's famous flamingo sequence. Also, remember that Gog smashing the gun I told you to remember? That was also him. Animation is a collaborative work. Itano is just a very good example of that. In a modern world rife with some phenomenal animation works, it's easy to forget just how memorable Gundam was, in no small part because of its animation. Yes, Gundam subcontracting meant characters and machines could be off-model. Yes, Gundam reused footage to save time and money. But Gundam also used clever tricks to enhance its limitations. Like the Dom's hover ability, which means the Dom is just kinetically intimidating without needing to have a complicated walk cycle. The space battles with their strafing and boosting combat for the mobile suits, or the aquatic combat of the Gogs. The slow and detailed character moments, as well as this show a wonderful attention to detail. Showing Amuro somewhat introverted and hesitant nature, Char's absolutely satisfied smile, replete with joy at being able to finally shoot the Gundam again. Kai's sarcastic defensive attitude, and it falling apart after his encounter and loss of Miharu. Bright's stern but tense confidence commanding the crew. Sayla's worry over battle. Mirai's steady helmsmanship or Frau's genuine worry and concern for the rest of the crew. By existing as an anime TV series, Gundam had the room to express these subtle details. I do feel strongly that the episodic nature of Gundam as a mecha anime lended itself very well to war. Its nature as a serialized show embodying that feeling of a prolonged conflict. I don't think modern viewers binging the series all at once really appreciate that fact. The shorter OVAs that followed are less holistic animated war, as they are really just windows into a much smaller part of it. In being a long-form work, it made the most room to flavor its conflict, define its battles, and populate it with characters we are interested in. And here I can give you the fifth reason. Why do we still care about Gundam? In using the freedom granted to it by the previous heritage of mecha works, Gundam's identity as a work of anime was free to experiment and build on the character design, mechanical design, and animation needed. Gundam used the long-form format of its TV anime to bring viewers into the long-form science fiction war story of its world. It pushed anime forward, and while not without flaws, it achieved this to great effect. With this in mind, let's wrap up this section. Episode 30 is A Wish of War Orphans. The Battle of Jaburo continues, and we are introduced to the fabulous Akai. Once more, we get a great example of the Gundam mixture. Mobile suits as aquatic special force platforms for sabotage, in the form of a giant brown dumpy gas mask Kappa. Notably, the episode is kind of a point of no return for the White Base crew. After battling for survival, they are officially given ranks and organized into the military. Amuro can't help but balk at the bad joke of the Federation, barely supplying them and then promoting their dead like Ryu. Ultimately, the sabotage is found out and averted by the orphan children of the White Base. Even though keeping them on board from here on out is more dangerous, the children decide to stay. Once again, if you try to interpret Gundam as this singularly serious and adult work, this makes little sense. War is the domain of adults after all, and White Base is a military ship, isn't it? But if you keep in mind that Gundam sits at the meeting point of adolescence, then it does make sense. The White Base crew are not soldiers really, they're family. Like Tomino's focus in Zambot 3, the three young orphans, even if in danger, stay aboard to preserve that element, especially now that most of the crew have been assigned an adult soldier rank. In the end, Char does battle once more. Amuro practically massacres the poor Akai unit, and Sayla and Char have yet another short chance encounter. Thus, we get to episode 31, A Decoy in Space. Slager, the first new lasting member and adult soldier, joins the White Base. Federation top brass select to continue using the ship as a decoy to lure out and annihilate Zeon's limited war potential. The cast departs Jaburo, and we get to see that handiwork of Itano I mentioned earlier. A climactic battle is waiting for the ship as it attempts to launch back into space. Meanwhile, Char is in pursuit. We get this great shot of the Zeon Zanzibar class purging its booster while chasing the White Base. However, here I need to pause. It is time to end this section, because the coming battles mark something big. Something that has been building for a while. Perhaps one of both the most important and most misunderstood aspects of Mobile Suit Gundam.
Ground control to Major Tom. Ground control to Major Tom.
On April 3rd, 1968, 2001 A Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick's epic, would premiere in theaters in the US. As I have said in the past, this was not just a well-crafted science fiction work. This was a window into the future, one Tomino saw. A future that would take only a little over a year to seemingly come true. On July 20th, 4 days after its launch, amidst the still ongoing Vietnam War, amidst the much larger Cold War which had spurred its rapid growth, in 1969, Apollo 11 would deliver the first complex, sentient, biological life from Earth to its moon. The humans that stood there did something unlike anything before. Descending to that place, they photographed the Earth. Even more than any of the previous astronauts, aviators, or explorers, the crew of Apollo 11 would experience something intense. A psychological phenomenon unique to space, but even more so enhanced by both the proximity to the Earth, yet also their great distance away from our homeworld. As Neil Armstrong would later say, "It suddenly struck me that tiny pea, pretty and blue, was the Earth. I put my thumb up and shut one eye, and my thumb blotted out the planet Earth. I didn't feel like a giant. I felt very, very small." All of humankind, all of our history, our triumphs and our tragedies, all the oceans, deserts, forests, mountains, nations, religions. This experience, one that indeed most astronauts do experience, though slightly different person to person, is one hard to put into words that has repeatedly happened. Author Frank White coined the name for this, the overview effect. Research from 2016 looked further into this and noted that it was described as a transcendent experience. Astronauts of both sexes and multiple nations, ages, and religions experienced it. Some felt it as overwhelmingly spiritual, others as a call to action to protect the Earth. Most experience it as a wave of connection to humanity and the Earth. And it really isn't that complex to see how it happens, even if the experience itself is almost indescribable. It's merely a genuine moment of extreme clarity of scale. For us humans living on Earth our whole lives, our mental image of the Earth takes up the entire world. From space, we see just how close together we all are, and how infinite and dark the cosmos is. Now, the interesting thing to note here, the thing that most people overlook, and which thoroughly proves my point, is that while many mention this effect as something Gundam obviously based itself on, they're both half right, and they're also half wrong. What do you mean by that, Argenbold? Well, put simply, the overview effect was not coined as a term until 1987, almost a decade after Mobile Suit Gundam's creation. But how could that be? Well, to answer to that point, it's because Gundam was tapping into something much bigger, something much broader. What really caught my eye, specifically, was this. From an interview with Frank White. "Finally, I discovered Gerard K. O'Neill and the Space Studies Institute," which O'Neill was the pioneer in thinking about settlements in what we would call free space, between the Earth and the Moon. Not building on a planet, but building what would have come to be known as O'Neill cylinders. And what he envisioned was human settlement. Doctors, lawyers, artists, poets. It was really beginning to move beyond science and engineering and math and the technical side. And that was the place for me. So I got involved with the Space Studies Institute, and that was my way in, and ultimately is what led me to the overview effect. Parallel evolution was happening. From the science fiction of 2001 to the landing of humans on the Moon opening the way, both Yoshiyuki Tomino and Frank White were following the same steps and work of Dr. O'Neill, merely separated by culture and an ocean. What better proof could there be? Gundam, Tomino, the production staff, were channeling something everyone had felt without needing a name to know it. For someone at that time, seeing the Apollo missions on your TV screen, you could look up out your window and see the moon above you at night, as humans had done for centuries. Just like the moon reflects the light of the sun, the Apollo missions reflected humankind on Earth back on itself through the medium of television. Some astronauts directly turned to environmentalism, but more broadly, humankind was shown a mirror of itself in the photo, the face of everyone on Earth. Even now, in 2022, basically half a century after the landings, the strong echoes of that hope and experience were rekindled recently by the Artemis flyby of the moon on its test flight. People still want to feel that unified sense of achievement and identity. Even 20 years ago, the Japanese band Porno Graffiti would channel a hint of that sensation with their first single, aptly named Apollo. Had the plans for Apollo been started, even longer before we were born, they really did think, let's go to the moon. It's kind of like an ideal born of love. Of course, they're using this as a metaphor for romance, but it's hard not to see the impact in its traces, and this is one of them. But for now, let's try to get back to the source. With this wave of connection and space came the massive cultural impact it would leave. I could list many, but one comes to mind as a perfect example. David Bowie. Bowie would pen his now famous Space Oddity, its title and subject matter inspired by 2001, with its folk and psychedelic style influence, and lyrics telling the tale of an astronaut. The irony was that it was rush-released on July 11, 1969, barely a few days before Apollo 11. The timing was perfect, and the BBC would use Bowie's Space Oddity as music for their broadcast of the landing. Bowie, thus, is a perfect artistic encapsulation of this time and the same overwhelming wave of awareness of space. However, this is just the second puzzle piece, building to what I think needs to be fundamentally understood. The first was the historical context of Japan up to the 1970s. To pivot to the third and final, I need only skip a few years ahead to 1971. After the success of Space Oddity, Bowie would see his next greatest success with the album Hunky Dory. Specifically, its hit single, his biggest since Space Odyssey, Oh You Pretty Things. Its lyrics are strange, quirky, but kind of ominous, telling of the coming of a strange new youth, a new Homo superior that will come from and yet replace the old mundane world and race of Homo sapien, of children who will represent this change. Of course, this was tapping into the political climate of the time, of a youth who protested the war in Vietnam, as Yasuhiko did half a world away in Japan, of a youth united through the new technology of music and television, of a youth made keenly aware of the scale of the Earth by the Apollo missions, yet also wanting to feel a larger sense of connection. Of course, much of Bowie's lyrics did not come from nowhere. Just as Space Oddity used 2001 as a base, Oh You Pretty Things tapped into ideas that were ebbing and surging well ahead of that. Specifically, The Coming Race, written a century prior in 1871, and more relevant to us now, Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End from 1953. The events of Childhood's End are doubly relevant. In it, a race of super-advanced aliens descend to Earth, rapidly evolving humankind's next generation, to the point that they become psychotelepaths. In the process, the remaining adults now grow estranged from their evolving youth, and both they and the Earth are destroyed as the new type of humans leave to join the Psychic Collective, an entity deep in space. One could easily see how this work would find traction with the previously mentioned youth of the 60s and 70s. Estranged from their parents' traditions and suburban restrictive post-war life, interconnected by media like music through technology, hoping for a connected future by Apollo. But it seemed we wouldn't need aliens to help us evolve. Perhaps going to space and music was all it would need, and maybe we wouldn't need to sacrifice the Earth. Maybe coming together to save the Earth was what would unite us. Before I get too far ahead, I do want to connect this third idea to already existing manga and anime, to show that Gundam isn't coming from nowhere. To do that, I need Slan! An American-Canadian author, A.E. Van Vogt, would write this very important work in the 1940s. But many of the same themes would exist. The Slan are a race of psychic engineered children, able to communicate telepathically. The main character, Jomi, is one such Slan, who needs to flee and try to save this new race of evolved humanity from their attempted genocide at the hands of the old world dictator who wants to wipe them out.
As a side note, this was the book that led to the phrase, fans are slans, which is a fancy way of saying that the fans of Slan were a new and interesting group of people, or more broadly, that the fans of science fiction were more imaginative and were more intelligent than others. You'll see why this is very much a parallel and relevant to Gundam in a slightly later section.
What makes Slan interesting is the work Towards the Terra, written and published from 1977 to 1980 by Keiko Takemiya, also starring a character called Jomi, a member of the psychic Mu race, also fleeing genocide at the hands of a despotic human space government. Both the manga and audio drama of Towards the Terra aired and were written alongside Gundam. Now this isn't to say that Gundam directly copied Slan or Towards the Terra either, as they were made essentially side by side. Rather, it's to show that the historical conditions of the broader 1970s, specifically in Japan, were rife with overlapping strong themes that many works were trying to channel. Indeed, in Slan, there's also a kind of psychic whose mind-reading powers are done via golden hair like tentacles. I've always personally wondered if Miyazaki read Slan, as the Ohm's embrace of Nausicaa also has an uncanny resemblance. Oh, but oh man, I cannot even get started on that. Nausicaa deserves her own 3-hour video at some point. Even beforehand, prominent works such as Babel 2 by Mitsuteru Yokoyama featured psychic youth blended with science fiction. Oh, and sideways hair! Genma Taizen, beyond having a rocking Keith Emerson OST, would also be another noteworthy work about young psychics. There is this connected idea of a new generation evolving to a point of empathy through psychic powers, connecting in the face of the old generation and the old violence they hope to no longer carry on. So you should now have a strong picture of what I'm getting at. Indeed, one of the most misunderstood and important aspects of Gundam. Put all the pieces together and we can arrive at what we need to return to the white base. A youth connected through media, music, television, perhaps even anime. Connected through a new worldwide sense of consciousness by the massive technological achievements and their specific effects. At the same time, a youth in revolt, against their parents and the concept of war. In the face of that hatred of war, hoping for a future defined by their connection, an evolution of the very essence of humanity, a psychic link, a contact, across ideology and race, across continents, a contact establishing an overview of all humankind as a solution. I want to prove this by returning to that quote I used earlier, but this time including one additional line. The quote from Yoshiyuki Tomino was, "I think that the human race, which has begun to proliferate, has no choice but to head towards self-destruction." It was around the time I launched the Gundam project that I started thinking about it specifically, and set the theme, will you be able to survive? I'm not referring to you locally. Humanity is what I meant. This is a terrifying story that can't be ignored. However, there was a time when I wanted to present a solution to this, if possible. A solution. I think now I've done my work in giving you a good idea of the concept. One criminally misunderstood while also being fundamental to Gundam. The new type. An evolution of humanity, born from living in space, able to psychically understand one another, born out of a reaction to war, born to a new space generation, perhaps giving them a future hope for something better. Just in case you think this is coming from nowhere, or I'm making it up, Tomino laid it out very bluntly in an interview from November 1979 in Animech. Yes, a girl will appear. This girl is the first precursor of the new types. When Amuro encounters her in combat, the new type parts of their consciousness resonate with each other, and their awareness as new types is magnified. These parts of them become especially expanded during battle. In other words, I'd like to end this in a way that raises the notion that even though humans fight wars, it isn't totally pessimistic. This is the true story of Gundam. Although it comes close to the Esper theory, there's another major reason why we're avoiding the Esper term. It's because I don't want the new type concept to be a singular one like the Esper. I'd like to show the possibility that all of humanity could turn into new types. Otherwise, we'd come away with the hopeless impression that the masses, like you and I, will ultimately be left behind. With Gundam, my greatest hope was to convey the idea that we ourselves could also change in this way. I think it would be nice if you could see how this is depicted on the TV screen. This is to me the tragedy of misunderstanding them. New types are not some clinical, psychological process measuring how much brain we're using. At the same time, they are not, yes Fukui, I am fucking talking to you, an unlimited source of supernatural, paranormal, mystic power. New types in the original Gundam are a philosophical plea. The hope of Yoshiyuki Tomino that amidst the ongoing charge of technology, war, politics, youth, and change of the 1970s, that there could exist a hope, born of a combination of those factors. This is the soul of the new type. We can now return to our story. Here I will be curt. Episode 31, 32, and 33 see the white base pursued non-stop, breaking through the Zeon forces while waiting in orbit, making for neutral site 6. Along the way, Zeon throws one mobile armor after another at Amuro and the white base. There is a continuation here of Gundam's commitment to its relative technical realism, military technology, and characters and family. For the first, we have this great moment where Slager reminds the crew they can rotate the white base while in inertial flight and fire backwards. a full 40 plus years before The Expanse, and most Western SF would make use of such ideas. The White Base crew also use ECM, electronic countermeasures, something a lot of SF forgets. We also have this nice moment of Sayla in troubled sleep, the detail of zero gravity in the chair's belt keeping her anchored. Mirai's tears turning into droplets as well. As for the second, we see a continuation of Gundam's military historical analogy, in the increased factional infighting of the Zeon, of their use of Wunderwaffe prototypes. Just like Nazi Germany and Japan throwing half-formed, half-tested technological ideas at the wall while they lost World War II. The Big Ro being one such, the Zagrello being an already cancelled design. As well, the Brabro hints at what's to come. For the third, we have Amuro's reuniting with his now mentally disabled father, and Mirai's encounter with her once arranged marriage partner. Both encounters are kind of brief and largely uncomfortable. Gundam continuing its ideas that the White Base crew, as a whole, is the family they will need to endure through the war. Slager even spells it out as such, saying what we have already felt before now. If Bright is the stern dad, Mirai is the supportive mother to the White Base crew. Of course, what I'm really moving towards is hinted at here, but lies most of the way through episode 33. Amuro has already annihilated a Musai cruiser squadron and his Dom escorts by the preceding episodes, but here in episode 33 things get desperate. After trying to get repairs for the White Base at a privately owned repair space station, the White Base is again attacked. Heaps of Doms, Musais, and the new Zeon Shive class. Amuro launches into the desperate chaos, the chaos of war, and guns down one enemy after another. Amidst this now finely honed combat abilities, something flashes across the screen. It's easy to miss, but it's there, right after the Gundam's visceral pose and third kill, flashing across Amuro's helmet. After Matilda mentioned them far earlier in episode 14, we see Amuro's new type awakening begin. Of course, this leads us into episode 34, a fateful encounter. The White Base is limped back to Side 6, and Amuro is caught in the rain. Finding a house to take shelter, he sees a swan take flight. In that moment, we see it again. A few fast frames, the new type flash. Only this time, he isn't in combat. Of course, those who've already seen Gundam know what is just about to happen and how important this scene is. Amuro's first encounter with Lala Soon. It sets up the entire crux of the idea of new types. It sets up the final character conflict and Char and Amuro's character arcs. It is the climactic tragedy and thesis of Mobile Suit Gundam. The show does as much bluntly within this episode, having Char Zanzibar dock next to the White Base and having Char meet face to face for the first time with Amuro. Everything is being set up here. Fleeing Side 6, the White Base is once more ambushed by Zeon forces, and once again Amuro is flat out killing one Rickdom after another. One of the pilots even says it's like he's predicting our moves. This also hints at the fighter pilot inspiration of the new type as well, where the extremely honed reaction times of certain aircraft pilots can seemingly predict their enemy. Even Bright is kinda getting freaked out by how lethal Amuro has become. Amuro has one new type flash after another, predicting ambushes and even predicting where to attack the Shive battleship to destroy it. Lala can sense Amuro in this fight even without seeing him in the news footage. The inclusion of Amuro's father is also an interesting one. While it's true Gundam's learning computer has advanced along with Amuro, his rejection of his father's upgrade circuit feels strangely specific. It feels like Tomino is using the rejection of Temray and his mechanical enhancement to say something. That the performance of the Gundam is not a mechanical, patriarchal gift anymore. Amuro and his abilities are what has become enhanced. Yet Amuro ends the battle not with triumphant glory or joy, but with tears. This leads us to the Federation's assault towards Zeon's homeland in space. Even Commander Walken spells out that Amuro is different. While the White Base is being essentially resupplied, we see Dozle struggling with the collapsing war effort of Zeon, complaining on being sent yet another prototype Wunderwaffe instead of 10 Doms. When the battle commences, we see a staggering scale at play. Dozens of ships and mobile suits gathering to assault Solomon. The battle is bloody and destructive. Once more, Gundam takes a page from the High Frontier. The solar flare system array, originally envisioned by O'Neill as a means of beaming power and light for his space colonies, now is weaponized to attack Solomon. We also see weaponized resource asteroids as well from Zeon. There's another great scene between the wounded Hayato and Frau, where she remarks that Amuro is different from us. The battle continues into the next episode unabated. the combat now becomes a brutal combination of boarding action and Pacific Islands campaign. There is this small personal moment between Mirai and Sleggar. I think that when I was younger I found it odd, not really seeing the chemistry between the two. But now that I am older, as Sleggar puts it, things are chaotic in youth. It's easy to see the carnage and turmoil of the battle emotionally sway Mirai, who once again is only 18 herself. It is in the middle of this that Dozle emerges in the Big Zam, a terrifyingly powerful unit that cuts down all of their grunt mobile suits and ships it faces. Seeing this, Amuro and Sleggar lead a counterattack to try and stop the Big Zam. It is during this attack that my reason for focusing on Solomon arises. Sleggar is killed by the Big Zam and Amuro goes ballistic, cutting into the machine with Gundam's strength. It is during this that Dozle, in a final fanatic act, confronts the Gundam with just a machine gun. During this confrontation, it happens. Amuro sees something form behind Dozle and the Big Zam. It is a manifestation, the first in Gundam's long history, of another new type in combat with Amuro. Whereas before, Amuro's abilities were seen as exceptional and unique, even though it's unlikely Dozle was aware of this. Here it's not just their physical machines, but their souls that have in essence clashed. And just as fast, Dozle dies. The manifestation vanishes. As the insert song plays, we see the survivors of the battle tending to the wounded, the hallways of injured. As much a continuation of Gundam's ideas that this too is building to what will soon play out. What transpires over the next 5 episodes is thus a delivery on this established setup, and the new type concept. There are of course interesting side events here. Makuve's Gyan is in essence the western suit of armor to Gundam's Samurai. However, even using ambushes and traps, Amuro is using his new type abilities to survive. We also find out Char sent Lala to the new type laboratory after sensing her potential. Amidst the battle in Texas, a colony in space, as Amuro is pushed to the limit against the Gyan and the Makuve, another first happens. Lala, having sensed Amuro's winning blow, reaches out and directly touches his mind. It leaves him, even in victory, stunned and nervous at this contact. Even the subsequent battle with Char's Gelgoog doesn't stop Amuro. It's also worth noting that Sayla has grown to be very competent and a deadly pilot as well by this point, taking out mobile suits and ships handily. It is after the battle where Char and Sayla meet once more that we get another major piece of the puzzle. Char's flashback to his father's deaths shows the motivation for taking revenge on the Zabis who have usurped power. At the same time, it is finally here that we get a concrete link that the founding of Zeon was directly inspired by the notion of humans in space evolving into new types. This adds an element of supreme tragedy to Gundam in the UC setting. That the nation in space, whose foundational figure and ideology was based on a progressive future of evolution of humanity to a better whole, an empathic one, was then corrupted and reformed by the Zabi regime into a nationalist, imperialist rhetoric and justification for the war. Thus, Zeon is infused with an element not just of the American Revolution, but also the shifting of Marx and his philosophy to communism and Soviet imperialism of the USSR. It infuses Zeon with a racist ideology of superiority that Japan brought into World War II, all tragically a corruption of what should have been the dawn of a new hopeful age via the new type. This conversation between Char and Sayla also reveals the hypocritical irony of new types fighting at all. New types, which would represent an end to war, are here instead being weaponized to fight one another. This is horrible. This is like the cure for cancer being invented, but being used to create biological weapons instead. In the end, Char tries to bribe Sayla to give up her service on the White Base, but we know she will not. Commander Walken's ship is destroyed by Char's Zanzibar. The war now enters a new and terrible stage, the full weaponization of new types. The Earth Federation forces, having captured Solomon as a base of operations to invade Zeon, now take horrific losses. The destroyer is Lala, the new mobile armor, the Elmith, a weapon capable of harnessing the mental projection and power of the new type for war. It is during this that Amuro goes into a trance-like state. Here, the abstract visuals of 2001 are being used by Gundam to show that Amuro in particular is resonating with Lala, new type to new type. The new type Chalia Bull also shows a sense of camaraderie between Lala and Char as new types. Thus, we get a sadness to these battles between the Gundam and the new type pilots. That this is no longer simply two sides battling, but in fact this is a new human group killing itself off on behalf of the old powers at play. Char even sadly suggests that perhaps new types are just mutants born of combat. Of course, Lala, the optimist, rejects this. At this point, Amuro's piloting has exceeded the mechanical limits. Gundam is overheating, trying just to keep up. Bright and Mirai also express doubt in the new type concept as some kind of precognition. The cynicism over this concept is very funny considering what will happen soon enough. Both the Federation and Zeon prepare the bulk of their forces in space for the coming climactic battles. Zeon will try to defend Lagrange Point 2, the Zeon homeland, using the moon and space fortress Aoba-Aku as a line of defense. The Federation will try to break through. As these forces clash, Amuro, Char, and Lala have their penultimate battle. The Gundam's new upgrades match pace with Amuro's abilities. Char's Gelgoog is barely a match, and Lala lashes out at Amuro for bullying Char with his new powers. Thus we arrive at the last chapter in this section, Episode 41, A Cosmic Glow. Cassilia spells out Char's relationship to Lala, and lays bare his motives. He is no longer singularly motivated by revenge, as he was when he got Garma killed. Lala has instilled in Char a powerful thing: hope, tempered only by Char's cynicism. The hope Tomino wanted to give through the idea of new types. Thus, Lala has become more than a romantic partner for Char. She has become a possible guide to the fruition of the concept for him. At the same time, Amuro remarks that possibly everyone on the White Base must be a new type to have survived as long as they have until now. Finally, both sides enter pitched battle. We get Itano's key animation in between the Elmith and the Gundam, Amuro using his new type abilities to predict the bits' control paths, or read their movements. The fiercer they fight, the more they connect. Lala and Amuro directly communicate to one another amidst this battle. This is where the new type concept reaches its first fruition. Soul to soul, Amuro and Lala interrogate each other over their motivations for fighting, all the while exercising the very projected empathy that lay within the concept. During this, Char has a new type flash, Sayla too, Mirai, as if the bond between Amuro and Lala is amplifying itself to the point that even others can perceive it. They are snapped out of this reverie by Char. Sayla, Char, Lala, and Amuro spiral towards the final tragedy here, the tragedy of the new type. And then it comes to pass. Lala, who brought its fruition to Amuro, is killed by him. This act will define Amuro and Char for the rest of their arcs as characters. It will define their animated lives across this and the next 3 videos. What transpires next isn't something meant for clinical definition. When Dr. David Bowman finally reached the monolith in 2001, the implication was that he had advanced as far away from Homo sapiens as Homo sapiens did when they advanced from apes in the beginning. What is transpiring here is far more sad, far more melancholic. It is the last and final blooming of the resonance of the living souls of Amuro and Lala. It is the premature death of the understanding which could have prevented the evil of war from happening. But to me, there's an even further tragedy here. Gundam as a franchise was exactly popular because of this, the 6th reason why we care. Gundam tapped into the space-age optimism of the times, the hope for a youth united through understanding, united against the wars that defined their youth, brought by art and technology to offer a solution through the tumults which defined this era. It tempered this hope with the melancholic tragedy of war, with the character-driven tragedy of Char, Lala, Amuro, and Sayla, with the sad reality that loyalty to adult war will always oppress the youthful dream of peace. Gundam resonated along a cultural ley line with this power. In resonating, it became popular. In popularity, it spawned sequels. At the best of times, this hope, the new type dream, lay at the crux of these works. At the worst of times, it is misconstrued, misinterpreted, taken literally, or outright dismissed. It seems especially stupid to me now, as a very cynical adult, that certain fans want to cut new types entirely. To demand a story in Gundam made only of professional soldiers, and to cut out this element. Can't Gundam just be about adult wars? To me, this rings of the most pathetic childishness. For who, besides children, demand to be adults so clumsily? Of course, they too are overreacting to how poorly handled later new types are, but it still strikes me as tragic. Forever stuck on the way to the solution Tomino suggested, never grasping it. But then again, I am biased. There was once a time in my life where I and others all sat in a room of young people. Like me, suddenly we had a strange bond form about us. We recounted the most painful moments in our lives and a sense of connection formed. We were like the White Base crew. We fought, we loved, we hated each other at times, but we understood one another. From them, there were a few who would end up defining my youth. Friends and companions who I grew to talk to late into the night, using technology to connect to one another. It was around this time I first watched Gundam. I had, in some ways, a personal Lala Soon, someone I could predict and connect to. My first, like Amuro, a person who I could look across the room and smile in synchronicity at a joke neither had spoken outside our mind. I don't believe in psychic powers or magic or anything like that, but I do believe in human empathy, and the hope that humanity can evolve into something better if just given the right perspective. But that time, like the explosion of the Elmeth, fades behind me into the past. Tomino's hope, my hope, the new type, endures, even if the person and the time is gone. Now we can conclude. The last episodes of Gundam aired in Japan in late January 1980. The climactic final battle of Aoba-Oku, the ultimate fall of the Zabis in Zeon. Daegwon Zabi is killed when Gihren chooses to vaporize both him and his attempted ceasefire with General Revel and his ship. Then the real battle commences. In many ways, it's a repeat of Solomon, but made even worse. The first Federation attack focusing on the approaching Aoba-Oku from the front, while the White Base and Second Wave fights upwards towards the fortress. Another Federation attack descends on the fortress from above. It is truly a battle in 3 dimensions. Here, unlike in many real wars, the final battle is not the last defeated gasp of a losing power. Instead, Gundam uses this as an opportunity to create still, perhaps, the single largest mobile suit battle in its history. It is unsurprising so many later works would attempt to show even a fragment of this slaughter. However, what is similar is the US involvement in World War II. While Japan had the initial benefit of early momentum and some technological proficiency, in the end the US, with its massive resource overmatch, once empowered with enough momentum, would end up totally dominating the Imperial Japanese in both technology, military, and raw industrial output. Char faces off with the Gundam in his new Zeong. The crumbling power structure of Zeon comes to a head when Kycilia kills Gihren in revenge for killing Daegwon. The battle begins to turn against Zeon. The larger forces and resources of the Federation mean even with its losses it is still winning. Char and Amuro's battle is a personal one with the death of Lala, but is also a battle of wills. During this, the White Base and Gundam are critically damaged. The fighting will use up the remaining strength of both the vehicles of our story, our spacesuit samurai robot machines. After destroying both their vehicles, the two confront one another. Amuro with the fury of Char's use of Lala as a weapon, Char with the frustration that Amuro has become a fuller new type than himself. Amuro points out the Zabis are the true enemy. Char points out that the horrible war was what forced Lala to evolve. In nothing but their pilot suits, the two will have one final battle in this one-year war. It's not a battle of triumph, or really even a battle of complex competing philosophy either. It is a contest of grudges, of wounds born from the war they were at opposing epicenters of. Sensing this, Sayla intervenes. Once more at the moment when both are the closest to killing one another. Lala, seemingly from beyond, also intervenes. These two lines so perfectly summarize Amuro and Char's personality and conflict. Amuro appeals to hope. Char begrudgingly turns to cynicism. In the end, the battle is once more inconclusive. The two tend to their wounds, and Char decides that he will end the Zabi's power himself. This is the last time Char will ever directly talk with his sister. He bids her farewell. Kycilia's death, then, is suitably climactic. On the edge of death, Lala guides Amuro back to the Gundam. From the core fighter, he reaches out. using his new type powers to reach Sayla, Mirai, Frau, and the others, guiding them to escape. They retreat from Al Bawaku in the nick of time. Seeing their home, the White Base, explode, they lose hope for only a moment, only to see Amuro emerge from the fireball death throes of Al Bawaku's destruction. Even the kids seem to now have this slight new type connection in predicting his escape. The crew of the White Base cheers in relief. He apologizes to Lala that he couldn't join her quite yet, that he must return to the world of his comrades and the living. There's an unbelievable sensation of relief. Amuro has survived. They all have survived. The year is now Universal Century 0080. Zeon and the Federation sign a peace treaty. The 1-year war is over. And just as it began on April 7th, 1979, Mobile Suit Gundam ends here on January 26, 1980, with 2001 Space Odyssey's Moon, Earth, and Sun, dawning on a new era. Of course, I can't end things just yet. This video has been long. It took long to consider what I would say, months of notes and research. It took long to rewatch, to write, and to make the script you now hear. But I would be doing a Gundam a bit of disservice if I didn't end on what happened next. The most obvious thing is that obviously Gundam's cancellation did nothing but help its popularity. Yamamura, Yasuhiko, Tomino, and the others' goal to create a work that deeply resonated with a smaller but passionate audience is achieved. Tomino's balance of elements between his literary fiction and giant robots worked, but it also would domino into so much more. As Tomino himself said in conversation with SF writer Takachiho, he had wanted to go beyond 2001 A Space Odyssey with Gundam. By word of mouth and by letter, the popularity of Gundam was a cascade. Dozens of broadcasters from across Japan would rebroadcast the series through 1980. The following toy-centric series, Trider G7, that Clover had hoped would get better sales, was completely overshadowed. It would be during these rebroadcasts that Bandai would unveil their 300 yen model kits. Gundam fan clubs popped up in high schools and universities. The impact of Gundam made these model kits feel important. Their more complex assembly but more accurate proportions to the show were only added pluses for these older fans. But Gundam not only captured older fans, but it had many female fans as well. Unlike the more male otaku-centered success of later 1980s and 90s anime, as Yasuhiko would comment in an interview. In retrospect, Gundam came out during a transitional period when anime was moving away from the standard hero pattern of storytelling. So while it's a military drama, there are still some unrealistic parts. Garma, the narcissistic rich boy, got called cute and became more popular with female fans than we ever anticipated. Even the freckled weakling Kai had his admirers. As for Amuro, many girls said he was the kind of character they couldn't leave alone, and they wanted to take care of him. The popularity of Gundam among these members would cause many fan circles to form. Clamp, who would later become famous for works such as Cardcaptor Sakura, have a great interview from the second volume of Yasuhiko's origin retelling of 0079. I just happened to see an episode with Lady Hamon in it. I was startled thinking, what's up with this anime? She's not an evil overlady. This is really what an original robot anime. And when it got popular with the second broadcasting, all the boys were going on about Gundam models. There's also this other amazing quote. I was really identifying with Amuro when I watched. Kai too. He got some depth in that storyline with Miharu. Yeah, Kai is delicious. Well, you heard it here, folks. The ladies adore and empathize with Amuro, but Kai is a certified babe magnet. Anyways. This wave of success would climax with the broadcasting of a series of new edited movies, adding new animation and condensing the series. They would premiere across 1981 and 82. Tomino, after just completing Space Runaway Ideon, would do a special in-person announcement at the first premiere. On the 22nd of February 1981, at Shochiku Cinema near Shinjuku Station, one of anime's most pivotal chapters, and the highest proof of the impact I have laid out, occurred. There were several thousand fans camped overnight, but even this was only an echo of their full size. Just as years earlier Voltes 5 had motivated and galvanized Filipino youth, so too was Gundam doing the same. The anime generation, the Gundam generation, had arrived. On the day of the premiere, there were 10,000 free giveaway posters stocked up for attendees. By 10 a.m., they were sold out. Exactly how many people there were who came to hear Tomino's speech is hard to say, but it was so many that Gundam, and anime, had seemingly created a crowd verging on political rally. Tomino would attempt to put his feelings into words. However, it is unlikely even most of the crowd initially heard him. There was a lot of pressure to break up the gathering before it became a traffic incident or someone got injured and the police got involved. So after he spoke, he doubted anyone had heard, and the crowd had not dissipated. Thus, it would be two young students, cosplaying as Char Aznable and Lala Soon, who would repeat his speech. These would be the young couple of Mamoru Nagano, who would go on to do mechanical designs on later Gundam works, and Maria Kawamura, who would be a voice actress on such projects as Gunbuster. 10 years later, they would be married with Tomino as their matchmaker. Indeed, Tomino then was already 40 years old. Perhaps to truly echo the spirit of his declaration, it made sense that the youth would reread his Anime Shinseki Sengen, Declaration of a New Anime Century. We gathered you here to make a statement, to make all the grown-ups wonder what so many young people want to say. And in fact, the statement we really want to make is not about Gundam at all, but Gundam is the name that has gathered you youngsters here today. We need the grown-ups to wonder what this Gundam is all about. We need them to understand what young modern people, teenagers, are seriously thinking about, and grasp that by seeing Gundam for themselves, even once. And so, why do we care about Gundam is really just, what has Gundam caused us to care about? Now you could argue that Gundam was just born from Gunpla. It was a commercial that functionally had enough depth to endear an older, more serious fan. A fan whose purchase of Gunpla would create a juggernaut. But to me, that oddly feels a lot like Char's cynicism, that new types are merely mutant weapons born of war, that Gundam's success was just good demographic buying into profitable merchandise. I guess here I am more like Amuro. I reject such simplification and choose instead to believe far more hopefully. I think you now know why Gundam had this effect. Gundam took the science and technology of the space age and used it to ground a story in the believability of a future just within reach, of a near future, a working technical realism. Gundam used our own bloody history and near political reality to create a war amongst that place, a war between Earth's violent imperial past and stagnating neoliberal future, a military tragedy. Gundam filled the combat of that war with characters, with youth, struggling through the hell of battle, dealing with their love, dealing with their hate, not to glorious triumph, but to survive. Gundam brought these characters to the forefront of the war in their mobile suit, a vehicle for a personal conflict of humans in their form within war, a personal machine of personal struggle, part military science fiction, part bright commercial toy, a fusion of both. Gundam did all of this via the medium of animation. A generation that had grown up on anime reached adolescence with Gundam. By building off of previous mecha works, Gundam earned the freedom to show that generation a reflection of their own struggles. Gundam used this to instill the hopeless despair of that futureless loss war curses us with. But it also gave us hope, that through evolution, change in the new type, that humanity may perhaps defeat war with empathy. So, here at the end, why did I, a person decades later, separated by distance, time, and culture, come to love Gundam? Why do so many people love Gundam? Why did I develop such a passion for learning history, war, politics, and so on? In no small part, I think it is thanks to Gundam. Why do we as a whole, all over the world, still care? The answers are the 6 reasons I gave. But the heart of the answers is much simpler. The heart is that Yoshiyuki Tomino made Mobile Suit Gundam to make us care.